Thank you all for coming. This is Alex Epstein. Alex is a philosopher, author of the book The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, and founder of a for-profit think tank called Center for Industrial Progress. I want to tell you guys a quick word about how Alex came to be here tonight. So I invited Alex to Lafayette over 2 years ago. And after he agreed to come, we managed to secure the participation of a climatologist at Penn State named Michael Mann in a debate with Alex. Michael Mann is, again, a climatologist at Penn State who has been raising the alarm bells regarding anthropogenic climate change for many years. Alex and Michael Mann have had numerous, would you say conflicts online or arguments or disagreements online?
I would say he attacked me and I asked him to explain himself and then he blocked me. So I don't know if that's numerous.
Yeah, and so, but Michael Mann is a very prominent figure arguing that, man-made climate change is a big problem. We need to take drastic action in order to deal with it. Alex has a different view. The Mill series actually managed to get both of them, which would have been a great event because they have not debated, correct?
That's true.
Yeah, and so anyway, I think this might be interesting for you guys to learn. So so we scheduled the event. Michael Mann was coming, Alex was coming, they were going to have a debate. The question was going to be, should humanity radically restrict fossil fuel use? That was going to be the debate. Michael Mann was going to argue yes, Alex was going to argue no. I went to a professor here and asked her if she would like to attend and bring some of her students. She's very involved in environmentalist issues on campus. Obviously, she would align more with the Michael Mann perspective. But I told her about the debate. I asked her if she would be interested in coming. She said no. And her reasons were, she said a few things. She said, Alex does not meet the reasonableness threshold. So, and therefore to give him a platform at a university would put a false impression in students' minds that his viewpoints kind of had more merit than they really do. That was her view. And then in elaborating on that point, she said that he ignores the science on, I think maybe on the extent of man-made climate change and its likely effects, and on the scalability and reliability of alternative fuel sources like wind, solar, and she also mentioned hydro. She also said that he is linked to the Cato Institute and the Merchants of Doubt, and I'm not really familiar, I don't even know what that means exactly, but...
Okay, you can ask in the Q&A, I don't think it's that interesting.
Okay, so that was how she kind of expanded on her claim that Alex does not meet the reasonableness threshold, and therefore it would actually be counterproductive for him to share a stage with someone like Michael Mann at a university debate. Again, the idea was that students would get the false impression that his viewpoints had more merit than they did. So she said she would not attend. Fine, right? But then that same day, Michael Mann pulled out of the debate. And I later learned that some professors had contacted him and urged him to pull out of the debate. And then you guys might or might not know this, but Michael Mann was actually invited to do a solo event by Lafayette several months later. Okay? So, and at that point I had already paid half of the Mill series had already paid half of Alex's honorarium. So I knew that I still wanted to bring him, and the reason it's been so long is that I was actually waiting until my tenure decision was made, because I thought if I brought him before my tenure decision was made, it might negatively affect the decision. Now the decision has been made, and so Alex is here. So anyway, 2 years after this all began, again, philosopher, author of The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, founder of Center for Industrial Progress. Alex, take it away.
Thanks.
Please join me in welcoming him.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, so that's, well, first of all, this is really a fun-size audience. So this reminds me of when I was getting started speaking maybe 10 years ago. This is my second smallest audience I can remember. The first smallest was 3, including the organizer, and there was no COVID. So for those watching later on the internet, it's not just that I was an unpopular draw. It's that we're in the middle of COVID-19 still. So Brandon's story is really interesting and not particularly surprising. And so what you might gather is I'm going to share with you a view that's considered crazy by a lot of people. And it's a view that I definitely did not expect to have when I was growing up, when I was in college, even through my mid-20s. And this is the view that one of the best things you can do to make the world a better place is to support more fossil fuel use. So like one of the best things you can do to make the world a better place is to support more fossil fuel use. And I advocate this so it's a kind of a crazy idea in people's view, and then I sometimes take what are considered crazy measures in favor of. So just to give one example, I have these I Love Fossil Fuels pins that I handed out, which that itself draws some attention. But I actually went several years ago to the largest anti-fossil fuel rally in history in New York City. There were 100,000 people marching against fossil fuels. And I was carrying the I Love Fossil Fuels flag. So I just thought I would show you this. Do you hear what they're saying? Hey, hey, ho, ho, fossil fuels have got to go. I have a very different opinion on the matter. Let's go see if we can engage. Can we just go stand in the middle?
It gives you like a good backstory.
Hey guys.
Which is really nice actually. That's fun. So do I, man. That's the problem.
That's not true. You better not.
I do. So yeah, there's a really interesting experience. They're all on YouTube. I'll share with you guys. If you put your actual email actually on the resources card, or if anyone watching this, just email alex@alexepstein.com Lafayette, because I'm speaking at Lafayette, and I'll send you a whole bunch of resources, including this. But when I'm at places like this, people's question is, like, what the hell are you doing? Why are you doing this? And I'm curious, can anyone guess what people's number one explanation is? Why anyone would hold an I Love Fossil Fuels sign? Not you. Yes?
Checking to see who engages with you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm curious who engages with me, but usually, I mean, the people there, particularly protesters, have a certain assumption of why I'm there. Yeah? Were you going to say something? Oh, I thought someone was, oh, you were stretching.
Yes.
Yes.
Is it to get like a rise out of people?
Okay, to get a rise out of people? Yeah, I think partially I suspect that. Okay, Brandon. Oh, no, you can go.
How about that there's a tyranny of the consensus? So for most of us, actually, we don't have the time or the speciality to engage in any one, like we really have to focus on one narrow bit of information. So by design, we have to believe what the experts tell us. So if by and large the propaganda that's put forth is that fossil fuels are dangerous, you're putting up an opposition to that, and you're presenting the other side when it's so lopsided on one side.
No, but he's asking why
Well, so
most
that's why
people.
he's doing that.
But he's asking why most people think he's doing it.
Yeah, most people don't have that sophisticated an
That's why
answer.
I would think you're doing
Okay, well, that's really, I'm glad. That's it. Yes?
Yeah, they probably think you take money for oil.
Yeah, so I think that's the standard kind of explanation is somebody is paying you to do this. Like, an oil company tracked me down and thought, oh, this guy could be a great spokesman, and they gave me a bunch of money, and then I started carrying the sign. And so actually, I didn't even know anyone in the industry when I came up with these ideas, let alone getting any money from them. And then often another thing is they think, oh, well, maybe you grew up in a place that's pro-fossil fuels, and maybe your family has heritage in it. So like you grew up in Kentucky or Houston or something like that, and so then it's well, yeah, you couldn't help but absorb it. It's just your environment. And so I grew up in a place called Chevy Chase, Maryland, which is in the DC area. If you know the DC area, it's not a like conservative, not that I'm a conservative, but it's not like a conservative or pro-fossil fuel place at all. I have no family in the industry at all. And that's part of why I had no expectation of coming to this view. And yet I came to hold this view of the goodness of fossil fuels, and actually the world should be using more fossil fuels, like so strongly that I would go to a protest like this. And the reason I'd go to a protest like this, and you may find this hard to believe, but it's 100% true, is when I see people attacking fossil fuels, like I think of that as an injustice on the level that this is like a civil rights building, like on the level of civil rights. Like, why do people go to protest for civil rights? Because they think like there's an injustice that is being done to people, often on the basis of race or something you just think is completely wrong. And like, I think it is that wrong for the world to be getting off fossil fuels. Now, I don't expect you to agree with me at this stage, and I may well not convince you tonight, but I at least want to give you the outline of how I became convinced of this. And I think the core of what led me to this is my background, Brandon mentioned, in philosophy. Now, philosophy is generally considered the most useless subject in the world. When I was 20, I was at Duke University and I was a computer science major, and I told my advisor, I'm going to become a philosopher. And he was very unimpressed by this decision, because he's like, well, whoever says I have a problem, let's call a philosopher for the solution. Like, philosophy is considered useless. And it's certainly, why would you think of it in energy, right? We just need to listen mainly to climate scientists. We're told, why would we need a philosopher? And when I was testifying in front of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, I made a whole statement, and then I'm in California now. My senator at the time, Barbara Boxer, she explained to me why there was no need for a philosopher, and then I explained to her why I thought there was.
Mr. Epstein, are you a scientist?
No, philosopher.
You're a philosopher?
Yes.
Okay. Well, this is the Environment and Public Works Committee. I think it's interesting we have a philosopher here talking about an issue.
It's to teach you how to think more clearly.
Well, you don't have to teach me how to think more clearly. You don't
I
have
think
to
I
try
do.
running.
So that was, and I didn't plan that at all, but that's what came to mind. And the reason is because I do think clear thinking is important. I believe philosophy, for me, it's the most practical subject, because I think clear thinking in anything determines how successful you are. And whether you're thinking about fossil fuels or relationships or a business, clear thinking is always better. And one thing that struck me about the thinking of energy, once I started getting into it a little bit and thinking about it, was that I really disagreed with with the methods that we're using to think about energy. I'll give you, I think, the main example. First, the positive. So this seems like common sense, but a lot of common sense things aren't common practice. So one key method in thinking is whenever you're evaluating alternatives, you want to look at the full context, which means you want to look at your options and you want to weigh the benefits and the side effects of each option. So I have your bottle of antibiotics, you're considering taking an antibiotic. What do? You have to look at the benefits and the side effects as precisely as you can, and then you need to look at the benefits and the side effects of the different options, including doing nothing, and then you decide which is best overall. And that's kind of common sense, and you think, yeah, of course we do that. But I noticed that in fossil fuels, we don't do that. I thought there's a tendency to look at mostly the side effects of fossil fuels and not the benefits, and this also applied to nuclear, interestingly, which we could talk about. And then with solar and wind, people tend to only look at the benefits and not the side effects. So for example, with fossil fuels, like one of the things that I learned early that really fascinated me, which I'll talk more about a little later on, is that one reason we use oil is because it's a uniquely concentrated form of energy. And the more concentrated energy is, the better it is for different kinds of mobility and transportation. And I learned that almost all the fuel we use to power all the farm equipment in the world is using oil, diesel fuel. And part of the reason is it's so concentrated. There's nothing else like that has the kind of strength to weight ratio oil has. And I thought, you know what, when we're making decisions about whether to get off fossil fuels, we need to consider this benefit of super concentrated energy. Yet I had supposedly gone to one of the top math science high schools in the country, one of the top universities in the country. I never learned anything about this. I had only learned about side effects. And I never heard anything negative about solar and wind. And so that's one aspect, is that I noticed a bias. So bias is in people are only looking at the negative context about fossil fuels, the side effects, and the positive context about solar wind. So I didn't know what was true. I didn't know, for example, it could still be that we're ignoring the benefits, but the side effects are still way worse. But I knew that that kind of bias couldn't lead to the truth. And then the next thing I noticed, which is related to the full context, is people weren't, even a lot of the leading thinkers weren't, it didn't seem like they were weighing things very precisely. So I'll give you an example. Like this idea of climate change. I was really interested in what are the climate side effects of fossil fuels? Like when we burn fossil fuels, how much warming does that cause? Like I suspected it did cause some, and I still believe it does. Like how much warming, how does that affect rainfall? How does that affect sea levels? But I really want to know with precision, like if it's 2 feet in 100 years, which is what a lot of the UN reports say, that's one thing. If it's 20 feet in a few decades, like Al Gore says in his movie, that's totally different. Just like when people are debating vaccines, like it's different if the vaccine causes a rash or it causes autism. Those are hugely different levels of side effects. But what I noticed when people were talking about side effects, they weren't weighing them very carefully. They would just say, oh, climate change is real. Like, are you a climate change denier? I'd say, well, it's not whether I believe it's real, it's how significant is it? What's the magnitude? And there was just a lot of resistance toward being precise about that. And so it was just almost impossible to get the full context of what are the benefits of fossil fuels, what are the side effects, how do those compare to the alternatives. So I became very interested in weighing those benefits and side effects myself and looking at particularly going forward, what can we expect the benefits to be, what can we expect the side effects to be. And when I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking in terms of a concept I like, human flourishing, which is a concept from philosophy, which different people have different interpretations of. But I'll tell you why I like this concept. The idea of human flourishing is human beings living to their highest potential. So you can think of like flourishing comes from flower, like a flower living to its highest potential, that's flourishing. You know, a bear can flourish. Human beings living to their highest potentials, that includes the physical world, it includes the mental world, things like happiness, and it also includes things like environmental quality. You can't think of human beings as flourishing if they're suffocating on smoke all the time, or if they're just totally ravaged by storms all the time. And I also like it because it has a certain long-term connotation. So you can't think of something as flourishing if it's just doing something that's going to destroy it the next day or the next decade. So when I'm thinking about fossil fuels, I want to think in terms of human flourishing. So that includes like a safe and healthy environment. So today I'm going to share with you the 3 basic ideas I have about why the benefits of fossil fuels going forward will far, far outweigh the side effects. I'll just summarize them and then I'll jump right in. So one is, for decades to come, fossil fuels will be by far the lowest cost source of reliable energy for billions of people. Then point 2 is reliable low cost energy is fundamental to human flourishing, including a safe and healthy environment. And 3 is that continued use of reliable low cost fossil fuel energy will cause some warming, but it will be extremely manageable, not catastrophic. So I just want to stress, I'm not arguing fossil fuel use has no side effects. I'm not arguing it doesn't cause any kind of climate impact. I'm arguing that the benefits of using it far, far outweigh the side effects. So let's start with the first idea. For decades to come, fossil fuels will remain by far the lowest cost source of energy for billions of people. Now, this is definitely not the view that we hear today. I think often if you look at different newspapers, what you'll see is the view that solar and wind are rapidly replacing fossil fuels. So it's maybe we needed fossil fuels in the past, that's great, but in terms of going forward, solar and wind are where it's at. They can rapidly replace fossil fuels, and this is why there's a very popular movement of what's called 100% renewable, which is mostly solar and wind. You look at, for example, in the presidential elections and in the elections, many candidates are saying either 100% renewable, get off the fossil fuels off the grid by 2035, get off fossil fuels entirely or be, quote, net zero by 2050. So it's definitely viewed that this statement is not at all true, and that if anything, solar and wind are going to be cheaper and they're going to create a lot of great jobs. So why do I think something contrary? Well, I'll share with you 3 facts that really shape my perspective. And fact 1 has to do with how long different alternatives, fossil fuels, have been around. So my perspective before I started studying energy was that most of the alternatives to fossil fuels are new. So I thought of it as, because I really had this question, and maybe you have the same one, when I was a teenager and in my 20s, like, why are we still using oil? Why are we using coal? You know, you read about the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, like they're using coal, and we're still using coal, and it's, at the time it was like 2010, now it's 2020, like oil, and they're kind of grimy and dirty. Why? And, you know, gas can explode. Why are we still doing this? Like, it didn't make any sense. And the assumption I had is, oh, well, just because all the alternatives are new. So we haven't had like solar and wind and biofuels and nuclear. They haven't been around that long, so they just haven't had the chance to compete. But now they have a chance to compete, and they'll rapidly outcompete these antiquated fossil fuels. So fact one that really made an impression on me was that this is not true. Actually, all the major alternatives have been around for a long time. Really, all of them have been around for 100 plus years, with the possible exception of nuclear, depending on how you think about nuclear. So it's over the last 100 years, entrepreneurs have tried to produce low-cost, reliable energy using many different fuels. So sun, wind, water, waves, tides, geothermal heat, wood, crops, radioactive materials like uranium and thorium, of course, oil, coal, and gas. And not only have entrepreneurs tried doing this, but there have been many claims that solar, wind, and others would overtake fossil fuels. So for example, this is one of the leading, I call them designated experts or thought leaders. So people that we're told are the leading experts. So like in climate and policy, Michael Mann is like definitely a designated expert in our society, like by the New York Times and the Washington Post. And at this point, I am not designated as expert by them. And this is another guy, Amory Lovins, who's probably the #1 thinker in energy in the 70s and still one of the leading ones today. So he says recent research suggests that a largely or wholly solar economy can be constructed in the United States with straightforward soft, that basically means green or renewable, technologies, he's mostly talking about solar, that are now demonstrated and now economic or nearly economic. So this is the kind of thing you could be saying today. But this was said in 1976. So it's interesting that these competitors have been around a long time, and claims that they're going to rapidly overtake fossil fuels have been around a long time. And this leads to fact two, which is what's the actual state of competition in the world, which I think most people even in the fossil fuel industry don't know this fact, which is that despite the existence of many forms of energy production, all these competitors, fossil fuels are the energy of choice over 80% of the time, and they're also the world's fastest growing source of energy. That really shocks people. So I think 80% of the time, 80% of the world's energy. So energy, I'll talk about more, is like machine food. It's what our machines eat, just like we eat food. They eat machine food or machine calories. Most of those calories come from, not just most, 80% or more come from oil, coal, or gas. So almost all the world's machines are operating on oil, coal, or gas. And every year, more new calories from fossil fuels are coming out than from any other sources. So even in 2019, there were more new calories from oil, coal, and gas compared to solar and wind. And that just seems impossible, given what we hear. In the Q&A, you can ask me if you're interested in how the news can say things that seem to contradict this. I'll tell you, they basically have a lot of ways of playing with words that are distorting this, but this is not I didn't get this from some conservative source. This is just nonpartisan data from all the sources. So we have this fascinating thing where we have generations of competition, and yet this form of energy, fossil fuels, we use more fossil fuels than every other type of energy combined times 4. And it's still the fastest growing source. So this raises the question, why is this? And I think we have to take this seriously. There's got to be there's something about fossil fuels that make people use them. And it can't just be, oh, it's a conspiracy by the industry, because there are places around the world like Japan that have no desire whatsoever to use fossil fuels. They don't have a fossil fuel industry there, but yet they're building new coal plants. China and India building hundreds of new coal plants. Like, why is this happening? And one way to think of this is, why aren't solar and wind so dominant yet after all these decades? Because my thought of it originally, and I think this is a common thought, is, well, look, the sun is free and the wind is free. And so why can't we just get this energy really cheaply? And that's often the argument. Well, of course, it's bound to be free. I was debating last year, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., to his credit, he debated me. And he's saying, like, yeah, it's free. This stuff is free. Like, So what is wrong with that argument? So I'm curious, does anyone who disagrees with that, if you agree with that argument, don't that makes sense, but does anyone have an argument why that might be wrong? Like they're free, the sun is free and the wind is free, so they're going to be cheap. Yes?
Maybe they're not as powerful?
They're not as powerful, so what does that mean?
In terms of like, let's say, maybe like the solar system can like make you drive a car, but it might not allow you to kind of like fly a airplane.
Interesting. So yeah, if you think about things being cost effective, part of cost effective is effective. So maybe it's solar energy can't be used to fly an airplane or power, a combine harvester. All right, so I think that's part of it. Yes.
Energy storage, specifically, I guess when it comes to for power grid scale, like wind or solar, you have the issue of when the wind doesn't blow or when it's cloudy or it's dark out. As for like cars or planes, you need to store that energy usually in batteries, and batteries don't have that energy density that fossil fuels do.
Okay, so I think those are definitely some relevant facts in terms of storage is involved. They're not available all the time. Any other thoughts? Yes.
So like they're not technically free. Nothing's free. That like so the per capita like energy produced by these like fields of like solar panels or wind, like those aren't free realistically. And I'm sure that they don't maximize like space like fossil fuels do.
What do you mean they're not free? Why aren't they free?
I mean it literally like costs money to like create wind farms like fossil and like
It costs money to create the wind?
like to create wind turbines.
Oh, to create wind turbines.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So there's something that needs to be done to actually get energy from it. I think this is all getting at it. And actually, one of my favorite answers to this, I found very illuminating, was offered by, of all people, Jimmy Fallon on Saturday Night Live. So I'll show you the clip, but I'll just give the context. He really made clear to me why the fact that something is from the sun or the wind or so-called renewable doesn't make it free. So he wasn't talking about the sun and the wind. He was talking about a different form of renewable energy, which is hazelnut energy. So let's hear what he has to say.
New Scientist magazine reported on Wednesday that in the future, cars could be powered by hazelnuts. That's encouraging, considering an 8-ounce jar of hazelnuts costs about $9. Yeah, I got an idea for a car that runs on bald eagle heads and Fabergé eggs.
So he says a jar of hazelnuts costs $9, but why is hazelnut energy so expensive? Because it comes from the sun. And I think what he would say is, well, it's not just the sun that goes into hazelnuts and hazelnut energy. There's a whole process you need to take the sunlight and make it into usable hazelnut energy. And that's true of every form of energy. Nature doesn't give us usable energy for our machines. What it gives us is it gives us raw energy. So it gives us things like the sun and the wind and coal and oil and gas. And then we have to go through a process to find that energy and then to convert it or transform it into some useful form. And so when you're thinking about solar energy, you can't just think about the sun. You need to think about what's the whole process needed to transform the sunlight into reliable energy. And I want to emphasize reliable energy because most of the energy we need has to be reliable. Meaning that it's available on demand as much as we need it. It can't just be, oh, you're flying a plane and the energy is available a third of the time, right? That's a very fatal problem. Even if the energy goes out for 2 minutes, that can be a fatal problem. And so with that in mind, I want to talk about the third fact, which is that solar and wind depend on backup from reliable fuels. And now, why is this? Well, because the sun and the wind are not themselves reliable, right? They're available sometimes, like right now, the sun is not available. But that's uncontroversial. So sometimes it's dark. I mean, most of the time it's dark or it's cloudy. And then a lot of the time, most of the time, even most places, the wind is quite calm. And so what does that mean? That means that you have to, if you want to get energy from the sun and the wind, your process has to find a way to transform unreliable energy into reliable energy. And just to show you what that looks like, this is Germany, which this really shed a lot of light on this issue for me. And this is just Germany. It's basically every day. It was the most precise data I could get when I was writing the moral case for fossil fuels. So I wanted to know how much electricity, and this is just electricity, by the way. This isn't for like airplanes and farms and making steel and stuff, which involve other things, other uses of fossil fuels, but just electricity. And I want to know how much are they using, and then how much is coming from solar and wind. And what you can see is solar is black, wind is gray. And so sometimes it's a decent percentage. You know, it might be 30 or 40 here. Today it's a little bit higher. So you'll see a headline that says, oh, Germany got 50% of its electricity from solar. And if you go minute by minute, you can say even higher. So it might be 75% a minute. You think, oh, great, Germany's powered 75% by solar and wind. But what's actually happening is it's sometimes being powered that much, but sometimes it's almost to zero when it's dark and when the wind is calm. And so the question is, if you want to have reliable electricity, what percentage backup do you need of the sun and the wind? Anyone want to guess?
100%.
Nearly 100%, very close to 100%. There's some interesting debates about this, but it's essentially it is very close to 100% because it's pretty frequent in these systems that you'll go down to like 3%. And so if you're going down to 3% and people still need the 100%, what do you need? Well, you need coal, gas, nuclear, hydro, so something reliable. Doesn't necessarily have to be fossil fuels. I'll talk about why it's mostly fossil fuels in a second. But it has to be some reliable power plant. So what does that mean? Well, when you're thinking about the cost of the sun and the wind, it's not just the cost of the solar panels and the wind turbines. And it's not even just the cost of those plus all the massive transmission lines that you need to like take distant solar and bring it to a city. It's also the cost of all the reliable power plants. So basically what happens is when you're adding solar and wind, you're not replacing the reliable power plants. You're not replacing that cost. You're adding to the cost. So you're adding infrastructure that's very duplicative. And so it adds a lot of cost. And that's why, I'll show this slide first, there's a tendency that the more solar and wind a grid use, the more expensive the electricity becomes. And just one example is Germany. So this is Germany. Starting in 2000, they started adopting a lot more solar and wind, and their electricity prices have doubled to the point where they're 3 to 4 times what we pay in the US. But even in the US, our electricity prices, particularly where I live in California, but even across the US, are artificially high because of solar and wind. And the way we can know this is if you look at the price of the major sources of electricity in the US are natural gas, coal, and nuclear, which uses uranium fuel. The price of natural gas has gone way down. The price of coal has gone down. The price of uranium has gone way down. So the fuel has gotten cheaper, and yet our electricity has become more expensive. The only thing that can explain that is we added a lot of duplicative infrastructure. And remember, this isn't replacing the fossil fuels, it's just adding on to the fossil fuels. Now you might think, well, isn't it still good because we're saving some fuel because when the sun is shining, the wind is blowing, we don't need to use all that fuel. Well, even that's only partially true. So if we go back to Germany, if we think about, by the way, this is a slide I hadn't mentioned before, just the cost of energy is determined by the cost of the total process. And if anyone wants my slides, just email me or write it on your sheet and I'll happy to send them to you. But if we look at Germany, so the question is, when the sun and the wind go down and when they go up and when they go down, and on a daily basis, within a day it's happening a lot, what that means is that the gas, it's usually gas, has to go up and down too. Well, when you accelerate and decelerate rapidly with your car, what happens to your fuel efficiency? Like in stop and go traffic. It goes way down, right? And so basically this is stop and go traffic for reliable power. When you have the unreliable fuels, it means stop and go traffic for the reliable fuels. So you end up using the fossil fuels or the nuclear or the hydro quite wastefully. So what we find is when we look at the full process or the total process of solar and wind, they're not replacing fossil fuels, they're adding a lot of cost. Now I just want to talk for a second about, okay, why are fossil fuels such a low cost process? And I think when we're thinking about alternatives, there are 3 things to recognize about fossil fuels. They have these 3 natural attributes that are remarkable, and they're actually only shared by one other form of energy, which we'll talk about in a second. At least one other technology that exists today, or even potentially to my knowledge. It's even on the drawing board. So one is natural storage. So remember the sun and the wind, they're intermittent, they're unreliable. They just flow and then they stop and then they flow. Whereas fossil fuels, the energy in fossil fuels, like in oil, it's just there. So it's available on demand. So that makes it cheaper because you don't have to store it yourself. You don't have to build a battery to store it. It's its own battery. And actually, it comes historically from the sun. So fossil fuels are actually stored solar energy. Now, you could ask, well, aren't renewable biofuels like wood and like ethanol, aren't they stored? And the answer is yes and no. They're not quite as concentrated as fossil fuels. But the main thing is they're not naturally stored in the sense that there's not that much wood lying around that we can burn. And even when people are relying on wood, they just deforest the hell out of wherever they are and they run out pretty quickly. So what happens is to get that storage, you have to grow it yourself. So you have to farm those and that becomes very expensive. Whereas the oil, we'll talk about abundance, there's so much of it, you don't have to farm it yourself, it's just available in the ground. The second thing is natural concentration. I mentioned this. So with oil, it stores a huge amount of energy in a small space, and that makes it really good for any kind of mobility or transportation. So there was, a couple years ago, there was this fiasco of there was this solar plane, and I forget what the economics were, but it was well over $1 million. I think it might have even been $10 million. I apologize for not knowing the number off my top of my head, but it was in the millions of dollars. It could only hold one person, and it didn't even make it its full trip because it's trying to use solar panels. That's an extreme contrast of, because the solar panels are so dilute. The sun is so dilute compared to something as concentrated as oil. So fossil fuels are naturally stored, naturally concentrated. And then the third thing is they are naturally abundant. So there's a ton of them. And the reason is because they come from ancient dead life, including plant life, that through processes was just stored underground and turned into these fuels. And there's just, in the case of oil, which is usually the hardest to find, there's at least 10 times more of it still in the ground that has existed than we've used in the entire history of civilization. So the amount of this stuff that exists is just huge. If we look at these things, natural storage, natural concentration, natural abundance, if we look at the alternatives, almost no alternative has these three attributes. Like solar and wind have natural abundance, but they don't have natural storage and natural concentration. Biofuels, they sort of have storage, but not really, but they don't have the natural abundance. Now, can anyone think of, and if you can guess this on the first try, I'll give you a signed copy of Moral Case for Fossil Fuels or an I Love Fossil Fuels t-shirt, whichever one you want. What is the other form of energy that has natural storage, natural concentration, and natural abundance? Yes?
Nuclear?
Nuclear. Why do you think that?
It's very abundant, it's very dense, and it's naturally stored.
Yeah, all right, you win, very good. Yeah, so nuclear energy, this is really important. So in general, human beings have moved toward we used to use actually a lot of renewables historically, like windmills in the Middle Ages, and we'd use plants and stuff, and we moved toward these very concentrated sources of energy. And so nuclear is really interesting because it's definitely naturally stored. It's stored, and the amount of energy stored holding the nucleus of an atom together is just huge. Like one of my favorite analogies I ever heard was a really good nuclear advocate, and I'm a really big nuclear advocate myself. And he was pointing out that coal stores a ton of energy. And he said that a golf ball of uranium has as much energy stored as Yankee Stadium full of coal. So that image always stuck with me. So let's talk about that. What about nuclear as an alternative? Now, one thing about nuclear that's really important is that most people who are anti-fossil fuels and who claim to care about climate catastrophe are very anti-nuclear. So we spoke about Michael Mann. Michael Mann is very anti-nuclear. He insists on solar and wind. And maybe at the end we'll talk about why, but it's instructive that the anti-fossil fuel movement tends to be against nuclear, even though nuclear has no pollution, no air emissions, and basically no CO2 emissions, except insofar as right now you need fossil fuels to make it, but less than solar and wind certainly, and it's opposed. So what about nuclear? Do we need to use fossil fuels if we have nuclear? Well, so here's the situation with nuclear. I think nuclear has the potential to be the energy of the future in many, many decades. But if you look at it right now, nuclear is actually declining in the world. And the reason is cost. Now, why does it cost so much to produce nuclear energy? Now, one reason, I don't think this is the main reason, is just it's a lot more complex to extract energy from uranium through what's called nuclear fission than it is to burn fossil fuels. So even though it's naturally concentrated, naturally stored, naturally abundant, it takes a much more complex process to extract it. And so that's going to add some costs. But I think the main reason actually is that there's so many regulations on it, most of which I don't think are justified, that it's basically criminalized to do it. So if you think about, and these are called safety regulations, but I don't think they help with safety, they just make it expensive. So you think about, just take, I think of this example with myself. So let's say I'm fairly well-off American, but not super wealthy or anything like that. Like, okay, normally I can afford to live a good life, but if you told me, you know what, Alex, like I think you're a threat to humanity. We need 5 police officers tailing you all the time. Well, think about what that would cost. Let's say their salary and everything else might cost $500,000 total. Like it would be super expensive for me to exist. And basically that's what happens with nuclear plants. They're treated as super, super dangerous. And thus we have huge amounts of people and measures used to make them supposedly safe. And it just becomes cost prohibitive. And so I believe long term and even short term, we need to advocate for the decriminalization of nuclear. You can ask me in the question period. I believe nuclear is actually the safest form of energy ever devised. I think people should be able to build nuclear reactors in their garage. It's actually impossible for nuclear to explode in the way people think it can. But in any case, this is a multi-decade, multi-generation thing. This is going to take many, many decades and even generations to catch up, even for electricity. And as I mentioned, there's no nuclear solution right now. I don't know if I mentioned this, I mentioned it for other things, for mobility, so like for planes and cargo ships. I think there could be, but we're just nowhere near any of this. So the issue with nuclear is it's just been held back so much. It's going to take many decades, but we should definitely be moving forward and decriminalize it. So it's really crucial for the future, but it's not going to replace fossil fuels in the next 15 years, which is what we're talking about. Plus, most people who say we need to replace fossil fuels are anti-nuclear, which is part of the reason it's a problem. Now, the other one is hydro, which is a really interesting form of energy. Because it's also widely opposed by many of the opponents of fossil fuels. So like the Sierra Club, if you go to their website, they'll say we got to get off fossil fuels. And they also say we're proud that we've shut down dozens of dams, like hydroelectric dams. And so hydro doesn't emit CO2, doesn't have air pollution. And yet people are against that too. But the real thing with hydro is it's great, but you need certain topography. You need flowing water and gravity to make it properly. And there is more potential for hydro in the world that's being used, but there's not enough to power the entire world. And even then, it's just electricity. It's not the like what's called heavy duty mobility, like planes and cargo ships, et cetera, and not like the what's called industrial heat, which is used for things like making cement and making steel. Okay. So that is the summary, and that's going to be the longest point because there's just a lot of technical detail, but it's important to get that this is why I think fossil fuels will be by far the lowest cost source of reliable energy for billions of people. There will be other things that are low cost on some scale, like hydro. Hopefully we can start improving nuclear processes, but there's nothing that can replace fossil fuels. So if we want billions of people to have as much energy or more energy, then we need to continue using a lot of fossil fuels. And so that raises the question, well, should we? How important is it that billions of people have reliable, low-cost energy? Especially if we're concerned about CO2 emissions. Maybe CO2 emissions are so bad that we should be willing to deprive people of reliable, low-cost energy. That's a position that you can have, but I think we need to recognize there is that trade-off. So if you want to dramatically lower CO2 emissions, you have to reduce energy use in the world. Right now, given the state of reality, there's no getting around that. You could wish it to be differently, but that's the fact. So there is this trade-off between energy use and CO2 emissions. And if you wanted to deal with it the best way possible, you'd advocate nuclear, which most of the opponents of fossil fuels don't, but even there's still a big trade-off. So this raises the question, how big a deal is reliable, low-cost energy? And this leads to my second point, which is that I think it is fundamental to human flourishing, including a safe and healthy environment. So I said, I think in terms of human flourishing, what makes human life go as well as possible, including having a safe and healthy environment. What I'm arguing is that this energy that people aren't paying much attention to, this is fundamental, which means everything depends on it, which means to lose it would make the world a much worse place and a much less safe and clean place. Now, why do I think this? I want to share with you some facts. And this, I think, is the most important fact about energy and really about life that we're almost never taught. So forget for a second on the top left is CO2 emissions. I want to focus on the others first. Start with the bottom right. We have population. So for years, and this is going back 2,000 years, but this is true going back 10,000 years and more. Population of the Earth was very, very small, well under 500 million. Now, why was it so? And then it suddenly skyrocketed up. Well, why? Well, one big reason, if you go up to life expectancy, is that life expectancy was under 30 for thousands of years. I mean, the average one of us would live to 30. I just turned 40, so this is very poignant to me. So what happened in the past is people died really early, so the population was really low. They didn't have birth control like we do. Like we can prevent population growth if we want through birth control. They cannot. Not forced birth control, by the way, but people can voluntarily do it. So we have this is life expectancy was really low, and then it shot up. It's like a hockey stick. And so you might think, okay, we have more people with longer life expectancy. That's pretty amazing. But from what we're taught, usually, wouldn't we be running out of resources? Wouldn't everyone be poor if there are that many people? And yet if we look at GDP per person, so that's income, which is really how many resources you have, that's going up like a hockey stick too. So you have a world where there are more people living longer with more resources per person. And it's going up rapidly. Now to me, you're in university, and this is what they call higher learning. Like in my view, this should be one of the first things, if not the first thing discussed in universities, which is how is it that we live in such an amazing world? Like what makes the world so amazing? Because we don't want to stop what makes it amazing. When we're thinking about changing the system, which you hear a lot about, I'm all for thinking about that, but you have to recognize overall for the average human being, this is the best system that's ever existed in terms of the way the world is going right now. And yet there's very little interest in this. I think there should be intense interest in this. So what we have is we have a dramatic increase in the average individual's ability to flourish. So they're longer life, healthier, more opportunity. And then at the same time, we see this interesting thing, which is that it correlates with a hockey stick of CO2 emissions, which is interesting because we tend to think of, CO2 emissions going up, the world is going to get worse. Like we're going to have shorter lives with no resources. Now the question is why do these correlate? And you could say, okay, well, correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation, which is definitely true. So you can show graphs of correlations that doesn't mean one causes the other. Like one of my favorites, a guy named Patrick Moore pointed this out to me, and I think about it a lot. Like you can show a graph that matches ice cream sales with shark attacks. It's like ice cream sales are low, shark attacks are low, ice cream sales are high, shark attacks are high. Did ice cream sales cause shark attacks? Did shark attacks cause ice cream sales? No, there's an underlying cause, which is summer, right? So this could be a coincidence, but I'm arguing it's not. Now I'm not arguing the CO2 emissions by themselves made life better, but remember CO2 emissions are what come from fossil fuels, and fossil fuels are the overwhelming source of energy. What I'm arguing is that there's a very strong reason why low energy use means really bad life, really bad world to live in for the average individual, and really high energy use means really good life. So why is this? Why am I arguing energy is fundamental to human flourishing? And you might be thinking like, how could it be energy, really? Because for instance, isn't it medical research or sanitation or developments in science and technology? And I'm going to argue, yes, all of those are crucial, but they all depend on reliable, low-cost energy as well. So why do I think energy is so important? Well, one way to think about this is to ask a question that's also not asked. There's a question of how did life get so good? One way to get at that is, why was life bad for so long? Why was life bad for so long? And I'm going to give a very controversial answer, but that nobody can give a refutation of. And the answer is that Earth is overrated. What do I mean by that? I mean, Earth is not naturally conducive to human flourishing. So think about that. Like, we're taught to revere the Earth. The Earth is amazing. Like, for all we know, it's the only planet that can support life. So it has amazing potential for life. It allowed us to evolve. So I love the Earth. I don't want to go to Mars. I don't want to change the Earth in a way that would make it impossible to breathe or go outside or something like that. But nevertheless, the Earth is not conducive to human flourishing. If it was, we wouldn't have this flatness. We wouldn't have low population, low life expectancy, low resources. That means for the average person, life is really, really bad. And so what's going on? Why is life so bad for so long? So one is the nature of the Earth, and two is the nature of the human body. There are huge limitations to both that energy helps us overcome. So let me talk about an issue in philosophy that I think helps shed light on this, helps us think clearly. Now this is first what I think is a false assumption that most of us are taught to believe to some degree. I certainly believed this to some degree for a while. And I call this the delicate nurturer assumption. And this is basically the idea that nature exists in a delicate balance. And you see this from academics. This is in The Lion King. For those of you who've seen The Lion King, Mufasa tells Simba, everything around you exists in I don't have it memorized, but exists in a delicate balance. And this is what we're taught, like absent human impact, nature exists in a delicate balance, and it has these three attributes. It's sufficient, meaning it'll give us what we need. It'll give us the nourishment we need. It's safe, keep us safe. We won't have all these climate disasters as long as we don't impact nature and make nature angry. And it's stable. It won't change too much. You see this particularly when we talk about the climate. People talk about the climate like, oh, the climate is this wonderful thing, but if we anger the climate is going to punish us. So there's this view of, the climate is a delicate nurturer. And on this view, if nature is a delicate nurturer, human beings are really viewed as what I would call parasite polluters. So when we hear human beings talked about, it's like we just plunder the earth. Like we're just taking stuff, we're gobbling resources, we're consuming too much, and we're polluters. We just make it dirty. And the idea is, therefore, if we impact the earth, it's going to destroy the delicate balance and us with it. And this is definitely the narrative around climate. Like we put more CO2 in the atmosphere, we're going to ruin the delicate balance of the climate, and the climate is going to come and punish us. And this is true of people worried about running out of resources, people believing that pollution is just going to get overwhelming. It's this delicate nurture assumption. And the problem with this assumption is just completely untrue. If nature was a delicate nurturer, again, we would not have life being terrible. That's not a delicate nurturer. So what is nature? I think a better way to think of nature is wild potential. So this captures both the fact that the planet has amazing potential, but that in its natural wild state, it's not very friendly. So the planet has the potential to be human friendly, but in its wild impacted state, it is deficient. It doesn't give us the nourishment like abundant food and clean water we need. It's dangerous. It's got all sorts of threats to us that we need to deal with. And it is dynamic. It's changing all the time. And from this perspective, human beings can make things worse, but we can also produce new value. So for example, we can take things on the earth that weren't resources and make them valuable, like aluminum wasn't a natural resource, it wasn't naturally a resource, and then we made it a resource. It was super abundant, but it was useless to us, and then we made it useful. So just like we think of birds can produce a nest and a beaver can produce a dam, human beings can produce new value. And we're also improvers. We can take dirty things and make them clean. So you think about like a swamp that's carrying malarial mosquitoes, like we can drain that swamp and make the local environment cleaner and safer for human beings. And so this view on the wild potential assumption, then, we view it as we can and must significantly impact the planet to make it human friendly. And I'm stressing this because I think that this is the failure to recognize that nature is not natural, the planet is not naturally conducive to human flourishing, causes us to not see all the amazing things that human productive activity does. So you think about it as nature doesn't give us the nourishment we need, it doesn't give us the safety we need. So what do we have to do? We have to produce material values to give us that nourishment and that safety. So we have to produce our food. We have to produce clean water. We need to produce sturdy homes. We need to produce clothing to protect us against the elements. We need to produce, hopefully vaccines to COVID-19, that kind of thing. We need to produce these values that allow us to flourish. And now this leads us to the second problem. which is the human body. The human body is very, very weak. Now, like you might think, oh, I go to the gym, like I'm pretty strong. But in terms of your ability to produce everything you need to flourish, like to produce abundant food, particularly when there are billions of people on the planet, to produce abundant shelter, abundant clothing, abundant medical care, if we're just using our physical body's manual labor, we can't produce that much. That's why when people are in a manual labor society, they are very unproductive. And so they experience the world as a very bad environment. We talk about the environment like it's perfect without us, but actually nature is a very bad environment unless we are very productive. So one way to think of this is the livability of the planet depends on our productive ability. And if we're relying on manual labor, our productive ability is very low. So how does energy come in? Well, energy is machine food. The key to productive ability is machine power, using machines to produce value for us. So machines are amazing because machines can do two different things. They can produce way more value than we can on our own. So for instance, a combine harvester producing food. One of these things can produce, run by one person, can produce enough wheat for 500,000 loaves of bread a day. You think about that. One person using this machine can produce enough wheat for 500,000 loaves of bread a day. That's 700 times what the best manual laborer can do. The best, not the average, the best. And so you just think about, wow, energy, machine power makes possible extreme productivity, but machine power depends on what? Machine food, energy, because without the energy, the machines don't run. And so the more machine food we can use, the more machines we can use to produce the values we need to flourish. And this is why the cost of reliable energy is so important, because in our modern world, we use machines to produce almost everything we have. In the US, for example, our machines, you think about average human being uses something like, average like manual labor human being is burning 2,000 calories a day. The average human being's machines burn 200,000 calories a day. So we basically have 100 full-time machine workers doing all this work for us to make us super comfortable and healthy. But we can only do that if the energy is reliable and it's low cost. So what happens if the cost goes up? Then we can afford to use fewer machines to do this work for us, and then the cost of everything goes up. But if the cost goes down, then we can use more machine power to benefit our lives. Now remember that we have like 100 machines serving 200,000 calories burned a day. I'll talk about the rest of the world in a minute. So this is the key thing this is one of the key things I should say about energy. So it allows us to do far more physical work than we can do manually. But the other thing it can do is it allows us to do machines allow us to do types of work that we could never do ourselves. Like no number of humans can fly, right? We can create a machine and it can fly. Like Jerry Seinfeld has this old joke about like, why are we measuring rockets in horsepower? Is it like, oh, if you ran out of fuel, could you have horses take you to outer space? And the idea is no, like manual labor, animal labor can't do this. So machines allow us they amplify our abilities by allowing us to do more work, and they expand our abilities by allowing us to produce types of value we can't ourselves, like the internet, Netflix, medical machines. All of these things are only possible with machines, and that requires machine food, which is energy. Now let's go back to the original thing. So this, you might say, this is really important. We can be a lot more productive, but aren't there things that are more important? Like what about medical progress? Like isn't that really what's driving things? And so let me ask this. I have another copy of the book, or I have an infinite supply of t-shirts if anyone wants those, or I can send you a book. What do you think my answer is to the argument that, oh, it's not really energy that's responsible for increasing life expectancy, it's medical progress? Or more broadly, it's scientific and technological research. You already got the prize. Yes?
We need energy to be able to carry out those experiments or the technology, the machines and stuff to do the research that leads to medical advances.
Good. So that's half the answer. So I'll you win, but then we can have one other winner. So part of it is all these things. So modern scientific and medical research is not being done on abacuses, right? They're not being done on pen and paper. They have amazing machines that are involved. So modern innovation requires machines to be very effective. Now, what would be my other answer? Can anyone think? The teacher can't answer. Okay.
Machines maybe free up time from time that was spent doing like manual labor, so that people could invest like that time and now like doing scientific research or whatnot, because they're not to be growing their own food.
Exactly, 100%. So you can have two if you want. Just write it on the sheet. This is a key thing about the relationship between energy and human flourishing. It's the lower cost energy is the more time we have to think and innovate. Because think about what life is like normally. We need to consume value every day, right? We need to consume food, and then we're eventually, like we're using our shelter, we're using our clothing, which wear out. So we need to take time to produce those things. And when we have manual labor, most of our time is taken producing the crude necessities. If most of your time is taken producing the crudest necessities, you're not engaging in innovation. Right? A manual labor society does not have the ability to deploy millions of medical professionals to fight COVID-19, right? It just doesn't happen. So the lower cost energy is the less time it takes us to provide our most basic physical needs, and the more productive time we free up for other activities, the more time we free up for other activities, so it can be leisure as well, but it also frees up a lot of time that we can use to innovate. So it's not that I'm saying technological progress, scientific research aren't important. They're absolutely crucial, but they depend hugely on reliable, low-cost energy. Final thing to say, so energy and human flourishing. So we have low-cost, reliable energy powers the machines that expand and amplify and expand our abilities. They free up time. One other aspect I want to talk about is our environment. So there's this correlation with basically every metric of environmental quality over the long term improves as we use more energy, which that seems crazy because fossil fuels, aren't they just making our environment dirty? Like you think about fossil fuels and water, fossil fuels aren't creating clean water, right? They're just spilling oil into the ground, or fracking is contaminating the groundwater, these different types of things. So let me ask, why does more energy use lead, for example, to more clean water? Any thoughts?
Yes. Pumping water from the source to the tap takes a lot of energy. Like water, we don't drink water from the river or wherever. So like the cleaning process, the transportation process through the pipes would take energy to get through your taps.
Yes, so that's what, and by the way, anyone answers a question, just message me and I'll send you a book or a t-shirt. So there's one other aspect too. So one is that nature doesn't give us water where we need it necessarily. The water is often distant, so we need to pump it, and that takes machines that take energy. Can you think of anything else that makes us require energy to get clean drinking water?
Water filtration.
Oh, I was asking everybody, you answered too, that's good. Yeah, water filtration, why? Why do we need water filtration?
Like toxic minerals or something in the water.
Yeah, there could be toxic minerals. So the way to think about it is nature doesn't give us accessible clean water. There's this idea that nature just gives us Evian and Perrier and Fiji, and it's all natural. And it's true, there are some really nice places for water, but that's not where most of us live. And so what we need to do is we need to pump water from where it is to where we need it, which takes machine power, and then we need to purify it from a dirty state to a clean state, which takes a huge amount of machine power. And so if we recognize that, then we get, oh wait, and this is a mind shift that was really big for me. Like nature doesn't give us, like fossil fuels don't take a naturally clean environment and make it dirty. They take a naturally dirty environment and make it cleaner. Now they can also have dirtying impacts, so we want to address those, and I'm going to talk about those under side effects. We have to recognize that energy makes the world a much cleaner place. And this idea that nature doesn't give us like a safe and clean environment, it really helps explain the issue of climate. Because I'm going to tell you what the most single surprising thing for me when I started looking at this issue was, which was what's been the trend as we've used more fossil fuels, what's happened to the safety of our climate? Because when I started studying this, I thought, well, of course, climate has gotten much more dangerous. Like, of course, deaths are up from extreme temperatures and floods and certainly wildfires. I mean, given what we hear this year, and drought, you know, anything you can think of course, those are going up. And so my suspicion is, well, those aren't going up, like those aren't as bad as the benefits of fossil fuels are good, but still climate's becoming more dangerous, and I'm concerned it's going to be way more dangerous. And then somebody pointed out to me, well, have you ever looked at the data about how dangerous climate is? And I said, no, I hadn't. I said, well, there's a statistic which you can like call climate-related deaths or climate disaster deaths collected by nonpartisan agencies. And what's happened as we've been using more fossil fuels and CO2 emissions have gone up? Actually, climate-related deaths have plummeted. So since the 1920s, which is the first time we have any decent data, the death rate from climate, so the percentage of people who die from climate-related causes, has gone down by 98%, which means the average person is 1/50th as likely to die from a climate-related cause as they were in the 1920s. So how is that possible? Well, if you recognize that the Earth is not conducive to human flourishing and it's a very dangerous place, then it makes sense, because the Earth doesn't give us a safe climate that we make dangerous. It gives us a very dangerous climate we need to make safe. And so what do we do with fossil fuels and machines? We produce amazing amounts of climate protection. So the most obvious ones are heating and air conditioning, but those are really easy to underrate. You think, I was in Austin, I live in Laguna Beach, it's a pretty nice climate most of the year round. Even sometimes there we need air conditioning. But I was visiting a friend in Austin, it's like 105 outside all day. And yet, good air conditioning system, fairly low cost electricity, and it can make comfortable in 75 inside the house. You just think about what an ability that is, or keeping warm in the winter. But it's not just that. How is it that we have sturdy buildings with insulation? Those are produced by machines. How is it that we provide drought relief? Like when people have a local drought and they're out of food, how do we prevent, you know, sometimes millions of people used to die in droughts and famines. Well, we have machines that transport huge amounts of food from one place to another. How do we minimize drought in the first place so it doesn't destroy crops? Well, we have irrigation. That's powered by machines. So what we have is we have all these amazing fossil-fueled machines that produce enormous amounts of climate protection. And that's why we're so safe from climate. And it's especially those of us in what I call the empowered world. And these are the 2 billion people or so who I'd say use a lot of energy. And partially the reason why it's gone down for everybody is because in the empowered world, we help the less empowered world out a lot. So for example, there's a drought in some place in sub-Saharan Africa, now we're able to help alleviate it. But it'd be much, much better, it'd be infinitely better if everywhere people had low-cost energy, low-cost machine power, so then they could really produce climate protection and handle almost anything. So what implication of this, if we're looking at the future impacts of CO2 levels, which I'll talk about soon, is that it would take a hugely overwhelming climate change to cause a problem. Because think about it, nature has huge climate danger, and we've basically mastered it by producing all this climate protection. So you'd really have to, it can't just be, oh, the temperature goes up a few degrees, or there are a few more storms, or sea levels rise a little bit. Like, it has to be a huge change. So the fact, if we cause some climate impact, that doesn't mean at all that there's going to be a problem. It has to be a massive and overwhelming climate impact. And when people talk about climate change, it's not just, oh, climate change is real. You have to show, oh, it's massive, unprecedented, overwhelming, which you can't rule out before looking into it, but it's a very high burden of proof. It's not just, oh, there was one more storm this year, I think it happened from CO2, so let's take away everyone's machine power, right? Because then you go back to the time when you can't deal with any storm and everything is overwhelming. So that's the relationship between energy and human flourishing. So again, the lower cost energy is, the more we can use machines to produce the values we need to flourish, the values that nourish us and the values that protect us, including climate protection. And also all the values that fulfill us. You just think about even enjoying nature, how much machines are involved in that and building the roads and getting you there. Visiting family and friends, how much machines are involved. One thing I want you to take away from this is just think about the world we live in. Think of it in terms of how machines are producing almost everything for us. That's what makes it possible. And then every time there are machines, there's machine food. And most of that machine food is coming from fossil fuels because it's the lowest cost, reliable option most of the time. So I've said all this stuff about the benefits of energy, and I mentioned in passing, only 2 billion people use what I would say a lot of it, anywhere close to what we use in the United States. The most, so this is just a summary, the most alarming thing is that 3 billion people in the world use almost no energy. Like almost no energy. So if you break this down, there are 835 million people, and this has been improving fortunately, but it's still at this level, who use no electricity, like none at all. Which is, you just think about how scary a prospect that would be for us and all the things that that prevents. But there's some overlap here, but there are 2.7 billion human beings, when they're cooking their food and heating their homes, which are two major uses of energy, particularly heating your home. There are 2.7 billion people who are using what's called biomass, or primitive biomass, which is wood or animal dung. So you think about the way of life when people are using wood for their heat or animal dung, what your air quality is like when you're doing, like, what kind of environment is that when you have very little energy and you're breathing in fumes from this stuff? And think about it, nobody talks about this when they talk about energy. It's just all about, oh, fossil fuels have negative side effects, which is fine to talk about, but you have to talk about the benefits are that billions of people can live in an amazing world, and there's still billions of people who don't have it. So as I said before, if you want to reduce CO2 emissions dramatically, that means less energy, and yet we live in a world where we need way more energy. So there are 3 billion people who use virtually none of it, and there are 3 billion more people who use only a small percentage of what we use in the US, like less, so 6 billion, the way to think of it is 6 billion people in the world use less than 40% as much energy as we use in the US. And that's a huge cost. So you might say, I'm so afraid of rising CO2 levels, it's worth it to deprive everyone of huge amounts of machine power. We have to realize that's the trade-off. And this is what I think a lot of the climate people who are just focused on climate, I don't think they take this trade-off seriously at all. Their whole focus is, do you believe climate change is real? Well, I can believe it's real and still believe it's totally worth it to empower billions of people. And that's what I actually believe. So if we continue using fossil fuels, and if we continue using more of them and keep pursuing alternatives as the alternatives become actually reliable and low cost, we can continue a lot of really good trends. So there's global poverty. This is the number of people making less than $2 a day. It was over a third of the world in 1990. Now it's less than 10%. Unfortunately, some of the pandemics and lockdowns is going to increase that, but hopefully we can get it down again. Life expectancy, 46 to 71 years between 1950 and 2015. Income per person, adjusted for inflation, risen by 372%, so almost 5 times as high. Infant deaths before the age of 1 have declined by 72%. So just think about the tragedy of infant mortality and how much that's gone down. And then education, this relates to the point about freeing up time. The average length of schooling has increased by 110%, so people have way more time getting educated. So my summary of this point is that continuing fossil fuel use is essential to billions of people having the reliable, low-cost energy they need to flourish. And I believe this 100%, that restricting fossil fuel use would be genocidal. Like, I mean that literally, and that's why I go to a protest, because I just think of it as, oh, you're going to put billions of people or keep billions of people in a primitive state. They're going to have to live a lot closer to what the average person lived throughout history. I think there's nothing worse you could do for a human being's environment than that. All right, so let's talk about the side effects. And I think the side effects are easier to think about once we really get the benefits, because the benefits are so environmental. So there's this question of all these benefits, is it worth it to inflict mass suffering and death to avoid side effects? And I think with the question of, well, so my view on climate, which I think is the main one to be concerned about, I believe it'll cause some warming, but nothing resembling catastrophic. Now, I don't think there's any case that any of the other side effects of fossil fuels could justify restricting energy use around the world, only to have good laws against pollution, but not to really restrict it. So if you just take something like air pollution, which is a conventional side effect, That's gone down in the US as energy use has gone up. So we do have cost-effective ways to reduce pollution. So it's not that it's not a concern, but it's not a concern that should make us consider reducing fossil fuel use in general, just having good laws about it. But with climate, there is a real concern because as we emit more CO2, it adds up in the atmosphere. And so people are concerned that, well, as more and more accumulates, what's going to happen? And if a certain type of thing happened, it would be like you would need to stop it. Like, for example, if just warming was very rapid and out of control and completely unstoppable, and the Earth heated 50 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that, that would basically be the biggest tragedy ever. Like you'd have to recognize, yeah, to stop this, a lot of people are going to have to die to avoid a much worse fate. But it's like it would be like the biggest war ever, kind of like against ourselves. But we have to recognize that there is such a cost. So I do believe it's really important to look into this issue, but we need to do this with precision, not the kind of sloppiness I mentioned. So I'll just give you the overview of my view, and you can read more in the book and in other places. So I just give you three things that really changed my perspective on this. And all of these, I want to stress, these are not speculation. This is not from political sources. These are all easily verifiable. So fact one is that environmental thought leaders, the people who are designated experts like Michael Mann, have been predicting imminent climate doom for 30 plus years. He's a little bit younger, so not him in particular. He's been doing it for maybe 20. But for example, this guy, Paul Ehrlich, so he's one of the world's leading ecologists. Not in the late 60s or early 70s, he said, if I were a gambler, I would take even money that England will not exist in the year 2000. Climate change is one of the reasons. Now, one of Ehrlich's proteges and collaborators, John Holdren, you may recognize him. He was President Obama's chief science advisor, so a very high-level guy. He said in the 80s, as quoted by his collaborator Ehrlich, it's possible that carbon dioxide climate-induced famines could kill as many as 1 billion people before the year 2020. So it's 2020 now. More people are being fed than ever by fossil-fueled machines. There's been nothing resembling famine. We have all-time lows of climate-related deaths. And it's not just individuals. The UN, which is the leading organization on climate thought, they have a history of claiming that we're facing imminent climate doom. So this is an article from 1989 about somebody saying, if we don't reverse the trend by the year 2000, there's going to be all these eco-refugees, and there was a 10-year window of opportunity in 1989. Otherwise, there's going to be a disaster. And so we're way past this, and what they predicted hasn't happened at all. So that's fact one, which is that and the reason this is important is because seeing the history of predictions helps put today's predictions into context. Just like if you hear a fortune teller for the first time, and they sound really confident, you might think, oh, maybe I am going to die if I take this flight. But like if you see them make 100 wrong predictions, then you become suspicious there's something off with the method. So there is this history of wrong prediction. Doesn't mean the present ones are going to be wrong, but it opens up the possibility that they could. Fact two, which I addressed from a different perspective, is that we've been increasing CO2 in the atmosphere for 170 years using fossil fuels. So it's not a completely unprecedented thing for them to go up. And what we found is that human beings are safer from climate than they've ever been. So I showed you this before, this climate-related deaths. CO2 in the atmosphere is going up, climate-related deaths are going down. I mentioned the main reason is because we're using fossil-fueled machines to produce so much climate protection. It overwhelms all the massive natural climate danger. But if CO2 has added any climate danger, it's also overwhelmed that. So far, if CO2 has added any climate danger, we can't even tell because our climate protection abilities are so great. Now, sometimes people think, oh, well, if they read my book, they'll say, oh, well, this data is from 2013. It must have gotten more dangerous. In my book, I talk about 20,000 something climate-related deaths. So the latest data we have from 2018, 6,646 climate disaster deaths in the world. So you think about that. Of course, you can always say every death is a tragedy, and that's true. But like 6,000 people, less than 7,000 people dying of this, and we're taught that this is the biggest problem in the world. This is worth taking measures that will literally starve people who won't have the machines needed to produce food, who will deprive billions of people of opportunity. Like this, climate is something that's getting safer and safer, at least so far. So how is it possible? Again, it's because we're so good at producing climate protection with machine power. One way to think of it is, you can think of us as masters of climate when we have low-cost machine power. So it's the climate mastery benefits of low-cost, reliable energy have far outweighed any negative side effects. Now, does that mean that that's going to happen in the future. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen in the future, but when people are making predictions, they better account for climate protection and climate mastery. And what you find is when you look at the negative predictions, they almost never account for climate mastery. That's why they're wrong. And so this is the third fact, and this has to do with how much warming we can expect. And this is while certain environmental thought leaders have predicted runaway warming and rapid sea level rises already, we've experienced only 2 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 degree Celsius, you'll often hear it in terms of in the last 150, 170 years, with sea level rises that are very slow compared to our ancestors. So there's this prediction of predicting it's going to get a lot worse, but what's actually happened is not what people have predicted. And why is this? I believe it's because man-made climate influence or climate impact is real, but it's very exaggerated. Remember, we have to be about precision. It's not just that we impact climate, it's how much. And I think it's dramatically exaggerated in the past. And I have reason to, and I think it's definitely being exaggerated going forward. So why do I think this? Well, one reason is, if we look at the history of the planet, it would be one thing if today's CO2 levels were record high, temperatures were record high. If the planet had never been in this state, it would be pretty scary because it'd be, oh, this is unprecedented territory. What's going to happen? Are we going to become like Venus? That kind of thing. But what this shows is CO2 levels are purple, temperatures are blue. What you can see is they're both at very low levels in terms of the geological history of the Earth, including, various evolutionary ancestors of ours thrived when CO2 levels were more than 10 times higher than we are today, and where temperatures were 25 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than today. Earth thrived for long periods of time with either temperatures 25 degrees warmer, life on Earth, and CO2 levels more than 10 times higher. So what this shows, and the Earth didn't burn up or any of these crazy things. So what this shows is that whatever CO2 is going to do in terms of warming, it's not going to burn up the planet or go out of control or something. Now, why is that? Because we're taught to think, oh, if we just add a little more CO2, at some point it's going to be a tipping point, it's going to be a disaster. Well, if you look at the physics of CO2, it makes a lot of sense. And this is something every climate scientist agrees with, and I'll qualify where they disagree, but they almost never talk about it. And I was really mad when I learned it and I started asking about it. Nobody would ever dispute it. But I thought, like, why wasn't I never ever told this? And this goes to what you can call the trajectory of how CO2 works. The trajectory means as you increase CO2, how much warming occurs. So one thing would be a linear trajectory. So it'd be like one new molecule of CO2 warms like this, or just take like 100 parts per million, it would be like 100, 200, 300, so it's like linear. So X amount of CO2 leads to Y amount of warming. That would be potentially alarming depending on the rate. But the alarming thing would be accelerating. So that every new molecule of CO2 warms faster than the last. So it looks like this. And that's certainly what I was led to believe. But in fact, it's actually a decelerating effect, or technically a logarithmic effect, which means each new molecule of CO2, when you can isolate it, has less of a warming impact than the last one. So you get diminishing returns. Each new one adds some warmth, but it's less than the last. So there are different analogies you can think of this to, but it's like, if you're painting the barn red, like the first coat of paint, you can still sort of see the barn through it, but then you use another coat and it gets redder, and then it gets a little redder and little, but at a certain point it doesn't get that much redder because it's already pretty red. And that's a simplified version of how this works. So what we would expect is that more CO2 leads to warming, but that warming starts to taper off per unit of CO2. And what we see, if we look at this in a human context, what we see is we've increased CO2 from 0.03% of the atmosphere to 0.04%, so about 50% increase, relatively speaking. And the temperature's gone up 1 degree Celsius, 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And to put that in perspective, this is how much daily temperature varies in New York. So the amount of temperature increase from our perspective is actually quite small. So you need a real burden of proof to show how this effect that's a decelerating effect is somehow going to lead to out of control accelerated warming. And if Michael Mann were here, he would say, well, they're what are called positive feedback. So even though the effect is decelerating, it'll increase things like water vapor, and that'll lead to accelerating. But even they admit that over the long term, it's going to start decelerating. So they might say, oh, it'll get 4 degrees warmer by the end of the century, 4 degrees Celsius. They might even say at the extremes like 10 degrees Fahrenheit, which I think is very unlikely. But even that, human beings could totally handle, and in some ways would be more desirable. I'm not saying I'm wishing for that, but we have to weigh trade-offs. Because remember, the trade-off is billions of people not having energy, not having a modern life. Like, human beings could totally adapt to anything, even the people who claim dramatic climate change. I haven't seen one scenario that has been held by any significant percentage, even of climate scientists I think are wrong, that human beings could not adapt to. So I think the main thing going on with climate is not that the predictions are exaggerated, although I think they are. It's that people underestimate adaptation. They underestimate our ability to master climate by using machines to produce huge amounts of climate protection. That's why they keep thinking the world is going to end. Just to give you one thing about, let's look at sea levels. We're taught sea level rises are unprecedented. This is from Wikipedia, which is very biased against fossil fuels and against me for that matter, if you look up my entry last time I checked anyway. But 10,000 years ago, we were dealing with really rapid sea level rises. Today, they're very slow. They might be less slow than they were 100 years ago, but they're not rapid. And if you're worried about sea level rises, just consider over 100 million people in the world already live below sea level because of climate mastery. Like, they live below sea level. So what is going to happen to sea levels that human beings are anywhere near this rate that human beings will be unable to adapt to? The whole basis of this climate catastrophe view is that you could call it's not climate mastery denial. Just denying the fact that human beings are really good at mastering climate. So they say, oh my gosh, sea levels are going to go up 2 feet. Whether that's true or not, sea levels go up 2 feet in 80 years or even 4 feet in 80 years, human beings can adapt. If you restrict energy use, human beings cannot adapt very well to that because manual labor is so limited. So this is basically the end. My summary is we're having a mild warming influence on climate that we can readily adapt to. And my guess is it'll continue to be mild, but even if it's significantly more than I think, we can readily adapt and it's totally worth it compared to disempowering the world. And so my full context conclusion about fossil fuels is that they have irreplaceable benefits and extremely manageable side effects, and thus they should be a leading source of energy for decades to come. Just to give you 3 quick policy conclusions, because we're in an election year. I'm not going to endorse any candidate, but because there are a lot of issues involved, but I want to impress upon you, this is a huge issue. So overall, if the world continues and expands our massive use of fossil fuels, life will get better across the world. If the world rapidly eliminates the use of fossil fuels, life will get worse across the board. That's a huge understatement. I mean, billions of premature deaths if that happened. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that everyone in the world is going to agree to stop using fossil fuels. Again, China and India are building hundreds of coal plants as we speak right now, and I think they should. They should be doing that. But what I do think is possible is that the US and other nations, that we will unilaterally restrict our energy use, and that will be very destructive to us. And that's something I'm trying to prevent. So if the US tries to rapidly eliminate fossil fuels, our lives will get far worse and far less secure from foreign threats. I think it's super important, whatever your party is, your affiliation is, to advocate for better energy policies, to have more energy freedom, including the freedom to use fossil fuels, and to reject these things like the Green New Deal, 100% renewable, net zero by 2030. Like, all of these things are like complete disasters that will hugely handicap Americans, particularly poor and middle class Americans, and they'll do nothing, by the way, about CO2 levels around the world. The only way to stop CO2 levels from rising long term is innovation that makes low carbon energy cheap, and it's almost certainly going to have to be nuclear. So I'm all for decriminalizing nuclear, but not for criminalizing fossil fuels. So again, whatever your party or anything like that, make this an issue. So if you're a Republican, encourage the Republicans to talk about this. If you're a Democrat, encourage Biden or whoever else to not oppose fracking, to not support these crazy schemes, because they are genocidal. And just to give you a resource, and I'll email this to you as well if you put your email address on the thing. EnergyTalkingPoints.com is a resource I created a couple months ago. And what this has is very short, I think punchy, well-referenced talking points on every issue. So climate, fracking, CO2 emissions, nuclear, anything you can think of, you can get really good talking points and share them with people. So really encourage you to check that out. And I think it went a little bit long, so I apologize for that, but you guys had really good interactions. I hope you enjoyed it. And I would just say that as a final thought, energy is fundamental to human flourishing. And if we have a world of energy freedom, we're going to have an amazing world in the future. Thank you. I don't know if we have time for Q&A, but I have time.
I have a number of questions, but I'll begin with a few, and then I'll move on. So I guess, I don't know where to start. I think you make a couple of points that I agree with. However, especially the second and the third point, I feel like that's where it just doesn't kind of add up. I think there's a lot of like fundamental assumptions as well in like your own arguments that I feel like there's a lot of fundamental assumptions in your own arguments as well that you're not tackling from the beginning, which is what makes me like struggle to like fully agree with you throughout the way. Like, I think you have an assumption that progress is good, and I think that is something that can be contentious from the very get-go, which then kind of questions a lot of your second point where you're advocating for like human progress and like leading to a better world and stuff. It's all also fundamentally like based on this assumption that like a capitalist world is the world that a lot of people will want, and I don't think that's always necessarily the case, especially if you look at, well, I'll get into that in a second. And then I think your argument is also based on this idea of like energy always leading to this, it's like a linear, like we're always going to be getting better. But I guess one of my questions would be like, couldn't we have made the argument that potentially, yes, there have been all these benefits that you described, but that's sort of like an exponential curve, and we're going to start seeing, like as you showed at the very end, like diminishing returns. So I think those are kind of things to consider. And I guess in terms of, I'll start with my first question. So on your first point, like the second fact that you give is that despite the existence of many forms of energy production, you talk about like how fossil fuels are the energy of choice for over 80% of the time. But I have a couple questions here. First is this idea of choice. I feel like this choice is imposed, especially on a lot of countries in the global south who are being forced to develop under like the Euro-American vision of what modernity and progress is. So I'd even question the use of the word choice. And then you were trying to describe like why it is that this happens, and then we were looking at how like the sun and wind and stuff aren't necessarily free. But I feel like we also didn't talk about just like the structural and ideological imposition of fossil fuels, the way that to an extent like there is not as much investment in other technologies, there's not as much research going into other technologies because certain countries and specifically like certain corporations are really benefiting from the investment in fossil fuels. And I think that's something that has to sort of like be acknowledged when you are making your argument. And then really the only other, I guess to begin, point that I would question is on your second argument where you talk about like low-cost energy being fundamental to human flourishing. I feel like you look at human flourishing in your second argument, but then, and when you're looking at the benefits, but you don't look at human flourishing when you look at the consequences. And you're not, like, what happens to conflict and the rise of conflict? What happens to the rapes that are occurring at, like, sites of extraction of this oil? Like, what happens to the actual insecurity that's occurring at the points of extraction? I feel like this human flourishing kind of falls, like, you're using it to your advantage, but then you're also not using it to counter some of your points. So that was a lot. I'll start here, but yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Well, it's probably better than what Michael Mann would have come up with. I just want to make sure I cover all these. But let's start off with the issue of the assumption, like where I'm starting. And it is, you're absolutely right that I am assuming that human progress is good. But then you also said that I'm assuming that a capitalist world is good, which I do actually think that properly defined capitalism, but I didn't say that. I want to make clear what I said and what I didn't and why. So what I said is my focus is on human flourishing. So, and I explained sort of why I like that concept, and that means human beings living to their highest potential. And there are different elements of that, and there's a question of what political system leads to that and what different political consequences have. But the focus that I really had is that human flourishing requires production. That's the core idea, that it requires production, and then production requires machine power. Because, and the point is, nature does not give us anywhere near the environment we need to flourish, so we need to be extremely productive if we're going to flourish. Whether you think, and this is, by the way, something that the original socialists and communists agreed with. This is a little bit different today, but like the original socialists and communists said, production is crucial, socialism will be much better at production. Now, historically, I think they were refuted, and there's this whole interesting fact that when the socialist countries failed at production, then they started claiming production isn't very important, quote, not impacting nature is important. But, so I want to be clear on, my core point is human flourishing, human beings living to their highest potential. I wasn't addressing every aspect of that, but I was addressing it requires production, and I'll stress three elements of human flourishing that I think are particularly related. think 3 elements of human flourishing, in my view, are: 1 is how much time you have on Earth, just how much time you have, period. 2 is how much control you have over your time, so what options, not just what options, but like how much are you doing what you really want to do with your life versus doing something that you just is imposed on you, so to speak, because you just need to make it to the next day. And then the third, related to control, is how many options do you have? Like, what kind of fulfilling options do you have? And I believe that a world where we're very productive, I mean, I know you have way more time, you have way more control of your time, and you have way more potentially fulfilling options. That doesn't mean that everyone is going to use it properly, that there aren't problems with that, but I believe production is crucial, and machine power is crucial to production, and low-cost energy is crucial to machine power. So that's what I want to say about that. And then progress is good in that progress in human flourishing. So human beings having more productive ability, more time, more control of their time, more opportunities, more options for what to do with their time. So then we talk about energy. The value of energy, is there diminishing returns? Well, in a sense, yes. I mean, there's diminishing returns on everything. It's a slight oversimplification, but in general, like, there's diminishing returns on money. Like, you have more money to a certain point. You spend the early money on things that are more valuable to you than the later money. It's not 100% true, because if you think in terms of happiness, it might be, okay, well, the money that you spent just to make it to the next day, like, you could still be miserable, but then there's money you might spend to, say, get an education and pursue your dreams, and then that actually generated a lot more happiness than the early one. So, but there is diminishing returns, but something having diminishing returns doesn't mean that it's still not valuable. And my point about energy in the world today is, so I think in the US, there's a lot of stuff we could do with more energy, but that wasn't my main focus. My focus is 6 billion people in the world use less than 40% the energy that we do. So I'm viewing it as we're in an energy-starved world. Most people do not have anywhere near the miracle of machine power that we enjoy. So there's just, there can be diminishing returns, but that doesn't change the fact that the world needs way more energy, or that fossil fuels can do it better. Now, you mentioned a bunch of what I would consider in the realm of side effects, or we could also consider them abuses. So you talk about, like, at different extraction sites, people's rights being violated. And let's just say in general, some claims about that are true, some are not, but let's deal with the ones that are true. Like, that is, and it's certainly true in countries where the government is owning it. The government owns the resource and manages the resource, or often the government will farm it out to a company that's somewhat unscrupulous. That is all bad and should be changed. But the reason I didn't focus on that is because that's not really an argument relevant to whether we should be using more fossil fuels. It's an argument that's relevant to how we should be using more fossil fuels. So with abuse, I talk about in the book the abuse-use fallacy. The fact that something can be abused is not evidence that it shouldn't be used. It should just be not abused. And so the conflict stuff falls into that category. So absolutely, we do need to view those as anti-human flourishing, but they're not inherent in fossil fuels. They're just abuses. And then the other side effects I mentioned more briefly, like air pollution, you can't totally get rid of, although you can mostly get rid of it even with coal. With natural gas, there's very little. But so those are real things, but they're inextricably tied to people having energy. Once nuclear becomes cost effective in 2 generations, then you can legitimately say, yeah, for anything you can do nuclear cheaper or the same price as fossil fuels, you shouldn't use fossil fuels unless they can make their emissions disappear. But we're not in that world. Okay, I think that covered that. Very good questions. Thank you.
Did he, first of all, answer everything you asked? And second, the answers he did give, do you want to say anything in response to what he said? Like, are you now convinced that progress is good, or do you still disagree?
Well, wait a second. Let me just say something before that, is that I don't expect, when I give a presentation, let alone an answer, my expectation is not instant agreement. My expectation is just to make my view clear to think about later. Like, most of the things I've become convinced of, somebody said them to me, and I thought at the time, like, no, that's wrong. Oh, but wait, there's a point. And then, like, I think about it, and then I would read other stuff. And so I don't hold myself to the standard of instant persuasion. And I think often when people are instantly persuaded, it's often a bad thing. But I am interested if you think there's some major thing I didn't address, and anything else you want to say.
Your response about the abuse point, I think that's a good response, and I agree that like how that should change. I think where I'm still unconvinced is like kind of with your arguments in terms of just carbon, like more carbon emissions having been like a net positive almost. I just feel like you're making logical leaps like that don't make sense. For example,
I didn't say they're net positive. I said if they're net negative, it's been overwhelming.
Okay, but for example, your argument that, for example, like climate change deaths have reduced over time. I feel like that's specifically if you're looking at like a drought or like a drought, for example, leading to a death. But what happens, for example, to like a lot of famine that is now being worsened by effects of climate change, because in the 20th century, you had over 70 million people die from famine. So I do think there's other things that have, it's like climate change to X to death, but because you're only looking at climate change to death, like we're missing a lot of these X's that are actually being caused by climate change. And the only other point I'd make to one of your responses about talking how like more, like having more energy is going to lead to better life for everyone. The first issue is like you have to tackle the issue of distribution, and that's premised on the fact that everyone's even going to have access to that energy, because there are, I think, political motivations to still keep people in poverty, especially for countries in sort of the global north. And so I'd question that, and you talk about how like all these people are going to die if we don't invest more in fossil fuels, but let's look at it the other way. If we keep investing in fossil fuels, who's actually like suffering the consequences of investing more in fossil fuels? It's those same people that you're now advocating are going to get the benefits. So I think there's just like an inherent sort of like contradiction with that argument, because the people that are now suffering from it are the ones, I just don't understand how that argument works.
Okay, great. I'm glad you asked. And then there was one thing you addressed that I didn't address, so I just was reminded of that too. So I get three things. So the climate deaths, I think it's plausible. That's a plausible assumption that I wasn't covering things like famine, but actually the reason why those deaths are so high in the 20s and 30s is because of drought and drought-related famine. So that the climate disaster deaths do cover those numbers. So what's happening is those things have gone way, way down, particularly drought and famine. And it's not true that they've, what's that?
Famine has not gone down.
Well, it definitely has gone down. I mean, in terms of,
You're seeing some of the worst famines we've ever seen, and they're man-made. Like, I don't see how you could advocate that. Like, I don't see how you can say famine's gone down.
Well,
Somalia, Yemen, South Sudan, famine has not gone down.
okay, so the reason I think it's gone down is if you look at the metrics of calories per person, distribution of calories around the world, and life expectancy and death rate, like all of these things are improving. So you can't have, I mean, it depends what you mean by famine, but fewer people are, like lower percentage of the world is dying from starvation all the time. So I mean, that's my view on that. We can discuss the data, but I think my view is the data is unequivocal on that. In terms of, you could say there are other dimensions of the climate issue that are important that one could ask about. So there's the issue of, I mean, interestingly, one thing that's not accounted for well in the climate data is cold-related deaths, because most cold-related deaths are not considered extreme, but there's actually most studies, like even mainstream studies on this show, just like one of the major ones concluded cold-related deaths outnumber heat-related deaths by a factor of 17. Even in a place like India or Madrid, cold-related deaths are more attributed than heat-related deaths. I mean, more deaths are attributed to cold than heat. What you could argue is damage. So for instance, like wildfires, right? In California, we're having these terrible wildfires, there's all this destruction. You can say, oh, fossil fuels helped us move all these people away, right? So they didn't die. But can we really live in a world with bigger and bigger wildfires and storms? And so that's a legitimate kind of point. And I just didn't address that for time. And so what you find is that if you look at, I'll talk about wildfires in a second, but with the phenomena in general, with these different damages like storms and floods, what you find is that the damages are going up, but they're not going up adjusted for inflation. So they're not going up like percentage-wise of people's income, less and less damage is being done by these storms and floods and wildfires. Now, the question is, here's another question for someone who wants a book or a t-shirt. Why is damage what's one reason that damage is going up that would have nothing related to do with climate? Why would damage go up even if climate stayed the same? Yes?
Like the cost of living and physical materials have increased so much, over the last few years that we're losing more money because we earn more money.
Well, it depends what you mean by the cost of living, because in a sense, the cost of living.
The cost of life, meaning it's great, and better off.
Yeah, right. So we have more. So you think about, we have more resources to put at risk. So more resources will be destroyed. And in particular, once we reach a certain level of wealth, we choose to expose ourselves to climate danger. So you think about a place like Miami, right? That has a lot of storms, a lot of issues there. But if you look at Miami in 1920 compared to 2020, it's a huge difference. There are these massive, almost massive buildings there now, all this wealth there that wasn't there before. So of course, the same storm hitting Miami then versus now is going to do a lot more damage now. And yet we're still better off, because back then it would have really wiped you out, would have wiped out your savings. Now it's like, okay, we have insurance, we can rebuild. And so when you look at the data, there is not an increase in climate-related damages adjusted for inflation, but also climate-related damages are largely a choice, plus that's partially rational, but also government like flood and storm insurance and stuff artificially incentivizes people to live in places like Louisiana, which many people might not live in without these kinds of protections. So the damages are interesting to look at. There's not a trend. The wildfires are the most interesting, because out of all of the trends, there are specific places where it's clearly getting worse in terms of damage. Like if you look at California, interestingly, it burned way more in the 1900s and the 1800s and earlier. So we don't have more absolute burning, but we have way more damage in the last couple decades than we have in the past. But that's not a global trend. So you see it in Australia to some extent, you see it in California, but it's not a global trend. So when we see a local trend, we shouldn't assume that it's a global factor, but rather look for local factors. And so California, the obvious thing that Newsom has only started to acknowledge is that we let a huge amount of fuel build up in the forest. And I think the leading cause of dangerous, out of control wildfires is huge amounts of fuel in the forest. So energy, sounds stupid, but energy is very powerful. So if you let a whole bunch of dead debris build up, you don't clear it, you don't do controlled burns, it becomes almost like a bomb. And that is something that can become overwhelming, because we need energy to do climate protection, but if we put energy against us, it's hard to counter. Just like if we explode a bomb, we don't have technologies that can really counter that very well. We can recover. So we're basically creating this fire bomb in the forest. But you think about it just logically, we can do controlled burns, we can do logging, we can clear debris, we can cut swaths of land to divide things up so the fire doesn't get from one place to another. The ability to master wildfires is actually fairly straightforward. So there's no plausible scenario where wildfires overtake the earth or something. Whereas you could make up a scenario where sea levels rose so much where it would be a huge problem. Like if they rose several feet a decade, it would be a real issue. So there's nothing resembling that, but so that's I wanted to address wildfires. Okay, I might have to ask, the one you addressed earlier that I forgot to address is I only addressed it briefly in the talk, is this idea that the individual companies have, I'm not accounting for the structural issues. So we have these entrenched fossil fuel industry and the alternatives are not getting as much investment, et cetera. And I addressed that briefly just by saying that because these alternatives have been around so long, it's implausible that it's these political, almost conspiratorial structural type things that I mentioned, a place like Japan that has no kind of structural incentive. They have a structural incentive to do other things, but they're using coal. And so I think if you look into the details, it's not actually what's happening. What's actually happening structurally is an inordinate favoritism toward solar and wind, the unreliable fuels. Look at Germany, a lot of Europe, the US. We're spending huge amounts of money and compromising, in many cases, the reliability of our grid, which is why we're having blackouts in California, because of these favored sources of energy. So actually, most politicians want to get off fossil fuels, and many people in the corporate world do, many people in the financial world do. They just can't do it because there's nothing as close to as cost effective. So this is a case where, yes, there are some abuses some places, but overwhelmingly the abuses are for alternatives, particularly solar and wind. And there's huge abuses opposing nuclear that some people in the fossil fuel industry have been guilty of, but certainly the renewable industry is terrible, the anti-nuclear department. And then, I'm sorry, the last, I just wrote something I cannot read, something about the distribution, thank you. Yeah. So I'm saying, this is another, so I'm saying, like, there are these billions of people, they need power, but if we use more fossil fuels, is it really going to get to them, or is it just going to be like I fly or my alleged cronies fly in a private jet or something like that? So that's a legitimate type of thing, because there's a question of, well, why don't people have reliable low-cost energy and low-cost machine power in those places now? Because the technology exists. And to use one of your terms, it's a structural issue. But it's not primarily a structural issue that the people using energy have imposed. It's primarily a structural issue that has not been, quote, imposed in the poor parts of the world, which is they don't have, you could say broadly, very good governance, but I think the fundamental is they don't have freedom and rights respecting. And so that's, if you think about the places that have done anything resembling respect for property rights, allowing businesses to function, even China, which obviously has hugely anti-freedom components, but has had enough of a right structure where foreign people could invest. You see in those places, different places in Asia, what happens is those people do get more and more energy, because what happens is if there's hardworking, albeit low-skill labor, it makes sense for people who invest in machine power to make them more productive. Some of that goes to the company, some of that goes to them. They get wealthier, they free up more time, they have more skill. It becomes this virtuous circle where they go from a low productivity state to a high productivity state. And that will happen as long as the countries have policies that are conducive to that. And you look at China and India, I mean, you have huge life expectancies there as they've been using more and more fossil fuels. That didn't require any kind of international charity or anything like that, but it just required certain political, legal frameworks. So that's, in a sense, that's the ultimate limiting factor, and that will continue to improve some places, but it's something we also have to advocate for as well. So when I say, and I should mention this more in my talk, I didn't mention this at all actually, so I should mention it. I should have mentioned it today, where it's not that supporting the freedom to use energy is sufficient to empower the world, but it's absolutely necessary. And in some places around the world, it is sufficient, because they are enough heading in the right direction that they will get empowered. And absolutely, there are forces in the modern environmental movement that are opposing it. You take places in Africa, for example, where fossil fuels are opposed. Loans are tied to not being pro-fossil fuels. Sometimes loans are tied to opposing hydro, like building dams in places like Congo. Like, that is evil, in my view, to oppose this kind of development. But the modern environmental movement is doing that left and right. So part of it is, yes, we need to leave people free. Yes, we should encourage better reforms, but we should absolutely do no harm. And right now we're doing a lot of harm by opposing fossil fuels, nuclear and hydro, in the poorest parts of the world. All right, great questions, thank you.
I have two things. Just like one comment regarding this, and then I want to talk about like nuclear power.
Okay.
So one thing, I think the claim that like famines in Yemen and Somalia and like sub-Saharan Africa, like the global south, I think it's bold to blame that on like the fossil fuel allocation in those countries. And I agree. So, and I think the premise that famine isn't included in those climate-related deaths is because those are mostly like inherent to like their state effectiveness and like okay, yeah, we can talk about that later. But anyway, the question is like, why do you believe that? Like, I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, but France is like relatively like the leading user of nuclear power, right? And then Germany's like the opposite, more or less.
Well, they're moving away from
recently.
It. Yeah.
Do you mind like elaborating on why those structural differences are there? Is it because of like the fear of international nuclear proliferation, or just because of like the harms associated with radioactivity?
Like, as an example of the question, why does France use nuclear and Germany doesn't, or why is nuclear so opposed and criminalized?
I mean, you can look at the U.S. too. Like the U.S. and Germany is the reason that like we criminalize nuclear energy because of its association with nuclear proliferation in general, or is it because of this like radioactive waste association?
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, so first of all, the U.S. still, I think this is still true, we produce more nuclear energy than anyone in the world, including France, but relatively speaking, France has the highest percentage of electricity. I think Sweden is second, although even France is starting to move away from it, interestingly. So, but nevertheless, there's a massive global opposition to nuclear, and it's really important that it seemingly paradoxically parallels a massive increase in concern about CO2 emissions. So again, this is the only source of reliable electricity that we know can scale around the world. Hydro is great, but it can't scale everywhere. You need certain kinds of bodies of water. Nuclear, you could theoretically use anywhere. And it doesn't emit CO2, so why is there so much hostility toward it? And I think the reasons you mentioned are what we could call proximate causes, but not ultimate causes. So if you look at how the average citizen thinks of it, part of it is this issue of it's associated with nuclear proliferation, which itself is a pretty vague term, but I would say it's associated with nuclear bombs. And so that is a false, it's not just a false association, it's a provably false association. So some things in the realm of science there are questions about, like there are questions about when you put more CO2 in the atmosphere, how much warming is going to occur. Like there's a lot of uncertainty around that. The question of whether a nuclear power plant can explode like a nuclear bomb, that is definitively known. It cannot. The same guy who had the comment of the golf ball, he had this thing I never forgot, which he said in response to the question of what would happen if a terrorist blew up a nuclear power plant and created a nuclear explosion, he said that terrorist should receive a Nobel Prize because he would have discovered a law of physics that didn't exist. So basically the nuclear material, the level of what's called enrichment in a nuclear power plant cannot explode. You need a totally different setup for it to explode. So that's just a false thing. So that can't explain why the thought leaders of the culture spread that and allow that to spread, because it's not something you could honestly believe. And then the waste thing is also a very weird thing on its own, if you're from a safety perspective, because nuclear it's a very small amount of matter for a lot of energy. So it generates, the waste itself has a lot of energy, which there are some ways to use, but it's very small. So it's like, you're stacking up oil drums, something like 100 foot high on a football field would be all the waste. And none of that waste is going into the air, which is a very nice thing if you can do it. So it's a very small amount of waste, and we can just basically seal it in containers, and it's not causing harm. That's why we don't actually have these three-eyed fish like in The Simpsons, and people aren't dying from this stuff. So it's a huge non-problem. So it's really interesting that the two problems with it are fundamentally non-problems, and they're respects in which nuclear is superior. It has the least danger and the least waste associated with it. So then there's this question of why are we opposed to nuclear? And a clue to it is to ask the question, why is the modern environmental movement largely opposed to hydro? Why is the Sierra Club in favor of shutting down dams? And if you look at that, they give a straightforward explanation that I think also applies to nuclear. What they'll say is, they'll often say, well, look, this dam is interfering with the swimming patterns of the salmon, or something like that. And what that means, what they're saying in a broader version of that is, it's impacting nature too much. Like the dam is impacting nature too much. But this is in the context where people are saying, we need lower CO2 ways of generating energy, otherwise the world is going to end. And my favorite example is James Cameron. He made that movie Avatar, which is basically just a thinly veiled demonization of fossil fuels and climate catastrophe. And right after he made that, he went down to the Amazon and told them not to build a dam. So like, what's going on? What's going on is, by his own standard, this dam is crucial for human life, but he's placing above human life the goal of not impacting nature. And I think this is the other philosophical issue that's involved here that I didn't talk about explicitly, but it has to do with this question of what is your standard that you're using to evaluate different decisions. So my standard I mentioned is human flourishing. But you could ask, well, what's the other standard? Doesn't everyone believe in human flourishing? The answer is definitely not. Almost nobody believes in it consistently. You can see this like in the world of animal testing. Many people who know that animal testing in many cases has huge benefits to human beings in terms of medical research still oppose it because they think the supposed rights of animals are on par with or greater than the rights of humans. So it's placing the lives of animals equal to or above the lives of humans. So that's not human flourishing because you're willing to sacrifice human flourishing, including medical cures, for the sake of animals. And it's the same thing is going on, I think, in an even worse way with the modern environmental movement, where they value unimpacted nature above human flourishing. So you look at, they value an unimpacted river over having energy and limiting CO2 emissions. And if the key thing, I think, is that the modern environmental movement, it's not about a good environment for human beings. It's about an environment or a planet that's unimpacted by human beings. And so I think of it not as the environmental movement, but as the anti-human impact movement. And if you get the idea that it's against human impact and limiting or minimizing human impact is its top value, it makes sense out of everything. Because it makes sense, well, why are you against hydro? Well, it has too much impact. Why are you against nuclear? Well, it has too fundamental an impact. We're playing God, we're splitting the atom, we're creating a new type of waste. Even though it's not very dangerous, it's going to be around for a million years, and it's wrong for us to impact the Earth with a new substance like that. And even with climate change, why is the assumption that climate change is bad? Why do we just assume, oh, climate change, that must be bad? Because we have this idea it's intrinsically wrong for us to impact or change things. Whereas on a human flourishing approach, it's good to change things if it's good for us. It's bad to change things if it's bad for us. If it has more good than bad, then it's good. So like what's going on with nuclear is the modern anti-impact movement views it as immoral to impact the Earth, and that's what's guiding them. And to connect that to that, what I said, the delicate nurture premise, the delicate nurture premise, you could think of it as a religion, like it's really an anti-impact religion in a lot of ways. So the core commandment is thou shalt not impact the Earth. And then the idea is if we do impact the Earth, by spreading the mythology that Earth is a delicate nurturer, it gives us this idea that we're going to go to hell. So, you know, it's like standard narrative in a lot of religions that like if you violate the commandments, you're going to go to a hell. Well, it's basically if we violate the commandment, thou shalt not impact nature and the climate, we're going to go to global warming hell. And if you see just the assumption that global warming is going to be something that we can't adapt to, even though that makes no sense if you look at any of the predictions and our adaptive abilities, it's because it's this religious quality. It's not a scientific view that nature is a delicate nurturer and that it's going to overwhelm us. It's just a view that we did the wrong thing and we're going to be punished. And so I think the anti-impact, you can call it a framework or a religion, that's the only thing that can explain this seeming paradox of we're against nuclear, we spread lies about it, even though it's the only scalable form of energy that doesn't emit CO2.
Is there a reason that you switched to like the delicate nurturer from the like perfect planet premise? Is there just a reason with like the connotation there?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So sometimes I call this perfect planet premise, and in the current version of the book I'm working on, I use it some places. So yeah, so sometimes I call it delicate nurturer, what I call delicate nurturer premise, I call it the perfect planet premise. And one is, I'm using delicate nurturer more now because delicate nurturer is more of a pseudoscience, it's more of a scientific, it's more describing how the planet works, whereas perfect is describing the moral evaluation. So if I say it's a perfect planet premise, they might not say, well, it's not exact, might not be perfect, but it's the best possible. So the reason is because I think it captures the kind of Lion King view we're given. Whereas if I say perfect planet premise, there's not really a visual there. Whereas if I say delicate nurture, you get this idea of nature is nice and we get to play with the frogs and there's clean water everywhere, et cetera.
I know that you can't make a nuclear reactor blow up like a nuclear bomb, but what about for, I guess, the example of terrorists or just natural disaster like we've seen in Japan with a nuclear reactor releasing radiation into the atmosphere?
Well, yeah, but you can release, so what can happen, so to say it doesn't explode is not to say nothing can go wrong, but the thing that can go wrong, it's usually some form of meltdown. So it overheats and there's a release, but it's important that a meltdown is a slow release that you have a lot of time to deal with, which is a huge luxury. Basically any other form excuse me, of energy that goes wrong. It's a near instantaneous danger that has unpreventable death. So like a gas line explodes, that's seconds, right? And it's just there. Even even the wind turbines sometimes catch fire and like go out of control or something. It's or solar panels catching fire, those kinds of things. Like those are much more dramatic. Whereas nuclear power plant, if there's a real level of danger, you have a lot of time to respond, and so that affects the death rate. What often happens though is because there's such a demonization of radiation, and it's this anti-impact idea, because really radiation is everywhere, but people have the idea, well, if it's man-made, it must be bad. What you actually do have deaths from is excessive or unnecessary evacuations, particularly of elderly people from areas. So what happens is like 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, et cetera, those didn't kill out anyone from radiation releases. You can theoretically have situations where there's that kind of danger, but it's still, like, in the scheme of things, much more minor than anything else that can happen. But you should, in something like Fukushima, you should look at, was that power plant put in the best possible place, like if it's vulnerable to tsunamis? But this is a use-abuse issue. So it could be, people cited nuclear power plants in the wrong way. In the case of Chernobyl, they actually used a nuclear power plant that was like a half plant, half bomb that nobody ever tried in the civilized and free world. So it's basically irrelevant to us. And even that didn't cause that many deaths compared to any other technology. So there are definitely hazards to it. And as this guy I mentioned, I didn't say his name, Peter Beckman, his point, he has this great book called The Health Hazards of Not Going Nuclear, and he leads with the point, I'm not arguing that nuclear is safe, I'm arguing that it is the safest form of energy ever devised. So energy cannot be safe because energy is, it's power. It's what produces power, and power can go out of control. That's why we don't want to build up a huge amount of dead wood in the forests, because then we release a lot of energy. So that is a concern, but it's definitely not a reason not to use nuclear, only to manage it better. A friend of mine from high school, I forget when he asked me this, but he's actually a really cool guy, became a successful investor, but he was just asking me, Alex, can you really support a nuclear power plant? Like, what if they build a nuclear power plant next to your house? And I said, that would be totally fine with me. I'd be a lot more scared of the dangerous thing near my house, which is a street. And like that's how I feel around nuclear. Like, that's safe. And there's good stats to the effect of, like, if you're in a relationship, you get more radiation from your partner's body. I guess I can tell you this joke. This is one of my favorite nuclear jokes. I think it was from Edward Teller, who's this legendary physicist who probably should have gotten a Nobel Prize, but he was associated with the H-bomb. I think this is the line. The point was that, if you sleep next to your wife, you'll get slightly less radiation than you would living next to a nuclear power plant. So he says, what is the lesson from this? He said, sleeping with one woman is okay, but sleeping with 2 women can be very, very dangerous.
Actually, Alex, that makes sense, because wasn't the model for Dr. Strangelove Edward Teller? Have you ever seen the movie? Yeah.
I never got through it. They tried to show it to us in middle school, and I think I was distracted.
It's worth your time.
Is it really?
Yeah. It's hilarious. So a couple of comments and then a couple of questions. So one comment is simply that I think, too, sometimes all parties tend to underestimate the extent to which we'll call them hydrocarbons or fossil fuels are not just fuels, they're also feedstocks for plastics, which are absolutely necessary for all facets of modern life. So just look around this room, even though it's an old-fashioned room with lots of wood, there's plastic everywhere. Mm-hmm. And furthermore, go into any hospital and almost every surface, everything is plastic.
Yeah.
So I think it's fundamental to our health, but also it makes so many things cheap. And why is that important? It's important for the poor. So when it comes to affording the basics of life, the bottom of the Maslowian hierarchy, energy, cheap energy, to your point, is where it's at, but plastics too have a lot to do with that. So I think it's just a point worth underscoring. So much of what you say really affects the poor most of all, not just the global poor, but the poor in this country.
Yeah,
so I think when you're talking about the moral case, I think that's often the proportion of a poor person's budget that goes to these basics is much larger than a middle class person's.
Yeah, I think those are both great points. I think the first one I think is really important, and it was actually the thing that initially got me excited about energy as I was learning about the history of oil, and I learned about what's called petroleum, what you can call petroleum products, so basically synthetic materials made from oil, and it just, like, I learned that, like, oh my gosh, you know, my sleep number bed is made out of the same stuff as was in the BP oil spill, which I don't know if you guys remember, but this is a giant oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico related to BP. You're like, wait, how does that black stuff become, like, it can become a sleep number bed, or it can become a bulletproof vest, or it can become an artificial heart. Like, it just blew my mind that we could do this. And the reason, why are we doing it with oil and natural gas? It's the same reason we're using them for energy. It's the most cost-effective way to do it. It also takes a huge amount of energy, particularly natural gas, to produce those things at low cost. So that's an important point. I usually just focus on the energy issue because there are people who are anti-hydrocarbon/fossil fuels for energy who say, well, no, we should use them for the materials. We shouldn't use them for energy. So that's an even bigger argument, that we shouldn't use them for energy because we need to save them all for the materials, which I think is a fallacious argument. But particularly because you have basically an infinite amount of coal in the world, and you could do that stuff with coal if you needed to. The poverty in America is a really important point, and I need to stress that more. But the flip side of that is thinking about, like, even the poor in America are so rich relative to history, and I want to think of it in terms of these elements of human flourishing, how much time you have on Earth, how much control you have over your time, and then how much and how many options you have that can be potentially fulfilling. Like, I wish I had a story where, like, I grew up poor, and I didn't grow up poor. I grew up kind of upper middle class, and so certainly not worried about food or anything like that. But my somewhat experiences with poverty were when I started my own business with very little money and had very little money, but also even in college, where I was fortunate to go to Duke, but I ran out of money in my, I'm not trying to get sympathy, you'll explain why I'll explain this in a second, but I ran out of my meal plan at Duke. I had basically no money. There's very little money. I didn't want to ask my parents for money because I wanted to be self-reliant. So I had to figure out, like, how can I eat as cheaply as possible and survive? And so I just would have lentils and tuna. And I could eat for, less than $25 a week. And I was just thinking about this recently, like, average American makes more than $25 an hour. But think about what that means. Today, even if you're relatively poor, with 1 hour of labor, you can produce your food for a week. And if you calculate it for water, it's like something like a few seconds to produce your drinking water. So think about that. That's what machine power does. It allows you to produce your food and water to a level where people in the past didn't even have, in basically 1 hour a week, even if you're relatively low skill. Like, in manual labor societies, that is completely unimaginable. So one way of thinking about it, I like, and this is in the new version of my book a lot more, I like thinking of a lot of things in terms of time. Like, how good the world, like, how you can think of, like, how good life is, how good the world is in terms of how much time does it take you to get a given value or avoid a given threat. And today, like, it takes us very small amounts of time to get the basics and relatively small amounts of time to avoid a lot of threats. And then actually we spend a huge amount of time avoiding threats that could kill us, like diseases. That's why I spend a lot on healthcare. I think there are ways to spend less, but nevertheless, like, it makes sense to spend money on life-saving drugs and treatments if they get you more time, particularly with all the opportunities we have.
So yes, I agree. And so one quick comment, one quick question. So the comment is that so much of this, I think, especially when it comes to waste, or even the materials themselves, relates to dose, right? So, and that's true of, I think, a lot of things in life. Mm-hmm. And so there's, like, the icky factor. I think a lot of people think, well, oil, nuclear, bad because it's icky. Wood, animal dung, good because it's natural. And
I don't think that. Okay, well, continue. Yeah. But I think it's they don't think about what they only possible. Are taught to think about the processes. It's part of the bias is that we're only shown the, quote, icky details of the processes that are favored. Because if you saw the kid in Congo mining for cobalt for a solar panel, you wouldn't think of it as clean.
Completely agree. And I when I'm communicating simply, I think a lot of folks don't think that way, and that's part of our challenge.
Well, so a lot of these things are, ideally, the educational system and the media, like, you can think of those, I think of those as sort of combined as like our knowledge system. That's what tells us what's true, what are the true important things in the world. Like we get those from schools, we get them from media, and they're supposed to synthesize everything that all the experts figure out and communicate it to us. And I think the whole system is maybe not essentially a failure, but hugely a failure. And energy is a perfect example of how. So the knowledge system totally fails on energy. We don't understand how valuable energy is. We don't understand the state of the alternatives. And part of that is we're given a very incomplete and negative view of the processes used in fossil fuels and nuclear, and a very incomplete and positive view of the processes used in solar and wind. So it's just, but the energy industry, that's the kind of thing that that's not that hard to overcome. The energy industry could do a lot more, and energy advocates could do a lot more. And I don't know how many of you guys have seen this movie that Michael Moore backed, Planet of the Humans, which was a mess. And I did a 2-part review of it on YouTube, but it was a mess in some ways, good in others. But what he did that was very effective is he showed the details of how the solar and wind sausage are made, and it alarmed a lot of people. So like, oh, I thought this was just magic. And it involves this mining and all this space and stuff, and all this burning of wood, and then taking wood, like chopping down trees in the US, grinding them into pellets, shipping them by oil-powered cargo ship to Germany, building them in Germany, burning them in Germany, et cetera, et cetera. So the issue of showing the truth about the different processes, both the processes and their results, that's something there's clearly an ability to make more vivid. Interestingly, the fossil fuel industry has historically been reticent to say that it's better at certain things than others. It tends to take a stance, oh, we don't want to be perceived as anti-solar and wind, which I think is crazy. If you're better than somebody at something, you need to say that. Otherwise, people will keep only looking at the negatives and not the positives.
Yeah, so you've just mentioned inputs, and then I'll shut up. But it's also true of outputs, right? So I think that sometimes, and you see this in places where windmills, for instance, have been installed, that people are very unhappy with the impact it's had on the landscape. And then furthermore, solar panels, and this is my question, seem to have a disposal problem, which I think often goes unaddressed, because there are, as I understand it, heavy metals contained within them, and they require maintenance and so forth. The same might also be true of wind turbines. Of course, we know about, they're the killers of these birds, which is in itself a problem, but I think that disposal of the blades might be an issue. I could be wrong about that. But I think that the outputs sometimes don't get addressed. So I guess that's a question posed.
Yeah, so the so you can think of the full process as what does it, what does it take to produce, what's the output, and then what does it take to dispose of it. I think the main point I want to emphasize is just that there should be objective discussion of the full processes. But what we shouldn't do to solar and wind is do what is done to fossil fuels, which is just act like, oh, there's an issue here with disposal, therefore it's bad. And you could deal with batteries as well. Like batteries have huge disposal issues, but those are not unsolvable issues. But they're a big problem if you don't acknowledge them. Because what happens if you don't acknowledge them, if you act like, oh, wind turbine is renewable, it's just going to compost itself when it's done, then you haven't seriously dealt with disposal issues, or you haven't dealt with the fact that these things wear out rather quickly. Like this idea of it's not only free, it's forever, which Al Gore says, or Robert F. Kennedy. Like, what is that? All these things wear out very easily. They're not renewable at all, right? It's all these, quote, non-renewable. I don't think, renewable I think is the wrong way of thinking about things. Anyway, but I think the issue is just we need to recognize the full process. And then we need to have fair and equitable policies that hold different processes to the same standards. So like in safety, we shouldn't hold nuclear to a 10,000 times higher standard than we hold fossil fuels. We shouldn't hold like a coal mine to different standards of decommissioning than we do a wind turbine. But I think ultimately, if we have property rights properly defined and we hold everyone accountable, there's no reason why we can't dispose of these things better. Or what will happen is the disposal costs will be so high that people won't engage in it. But I can't predict whether that's the case or not, and it could be they come up with innovations. So I just want to stress, I'm all for, I want to recognize the reality of things and encourage them to improve under a fair system, not demonize it as, oh, this is hopeless. But they should, I do believe, I did a podcast about this last week, I do believe in some form or another the grid is the grid does not properly value reliable electricity, and it basically just rewards people the same for producing reliable electricity and unreliable electricity, which makes absolutely no sense, and is part of the reason why we have blackouts in California.
I do want to preface it with one thing. Despite all my questions, I do believe that there is a case for fossil fuels in development and stuff, so I'm not fully anti-fossil fuels. I'm just, I wanted to preface that. I think, okay, my first question then, going to your wild nature hypothesis, you know how you kind of use this assumption that the Earth in its uninhibited form is dangerous and people can't thrive in all of the points you were making. If that's the case, how do you explain like our current existence? Like, wouldn't we have technically been wiped out by the Earth if the Earth, uncontrolled by man, is actually more powerful than us?
Good question. I thought you were also going to bring up hunter-gatherers, which is an interesting thing as well, because there are like claims, hunter-gatherers had more free time and stuff. So I'll address both what you asked and what you might ask. So I want to be very deliberate. What I said is the Earth is not conducive to human flourishing. And so that's, and particularly I stressed the flourishing of the average person. So when I showed those graphs, those hockey sticks, it's the average person who's living at a very low level. But there are certain people, so there are a couple of dimensions of this, but if you go back 1,000 years ago, or 500 years ago, let's say, there are certain people who were living at a level that would sort of resemble flourishing. Like certain people did not have to worry about food usually or water easily. And in fact, they could have very sturdy buildings or relatively sturdy buildings. Even in some cases, they could have like ice brought to them to cool them off in the summer, and they could have a certain kind of air conditioning, and they would have enough heating. Now, who had that? What kinds of people had that? Yeah.
Like a king or a queen?
King or queen. I mean, you could think of it as powerful people, right? But what does it mean to be powerful? It means that you're harnessing a lot of energy. But what are you doing? Instead of using machines as machines, you're using humans as machines. And that's so much of what goes on. Like, why is slavery universal throughout history, and why is it not universal now? A huge thing is machine power, and not just slavery, but more broadly like conquest and servitude. Because if you're limited by manual labor, you can get animals to do some stuff, but basically what you try to do is you try to force other humans to do work for you so you can live at any kind of decent level. And so now we consider that immoral, but that used to be considered normal everywhere, because otherwise you're just going to live this precarious existence. And so the point is, the Earth in its unimpacted state, human flourishing is impossible for the average person, but it's possible for a limited group of exploiters. And the reason we're still here is it's possible enough for the continuation of the species. So I distinguish between enough survival and reproduction for the continuation of the species versus enough survival and versus enough production for the average human being to survive a long time, to have a lot of control of their life, and to have a lot of options. Now, hunter-gatherers are kind of an interesting thing people bring up, because you'll like look at certain societies and you'll see, oh well, like it looks like they had 6 hours a day of leisure time. Like they do a hunt in the morning and gather some berries, and they seem to be able to live on that. And so there are a bunch of things to say about this. And one thing is obviously the precariousness of their life was very high. This way of life lends itself toward war, but there is something in terms of some people had more leisure opportunity, and that all things being equal is good. But for our purposes, the main thing with that is we have population levels now where that kind of life is completely impossible. Now somebody could say, oh, I wish there were still just 1 million people on the planet or whatever. But okay, but do you really wish that? Because there's 8 billion now. So the only way to get to that is genocide. So there's no, on the Earth, like with a certain limited human population, we can sort of live like animals, which is a lot of how hunter-gatherer life is. Like we can sort of just take what nature produces if we're willing to roam around a lot and war with some other people. But nature doesn't produce enough for even 1 billion people to flourish, let alone 8 billion. So what we can do is, though, if we say, wow, that hunter-gatherer looks like it was fun to have 5 hours of free time a day, guess what? We can do that ourselves. Now, people might not choose to do that, but they have the choice. So there's a lot of things you can say about modern society where we might not use the opportunity of the modern empowered world well enough. Like, oh, maybe we eat too much junk food, or maybe we waste our time. You can make that case to somebody, but you still want to live in an empowered world. You just want to make better use of it. You don't want to live in an impossible hunter-gatherer society or a possible poor society.
Then to respond to that, don't you then see this whole idea though, like you're assuming that as humans then we deserve to be on Earth and it's our duty to make the Earth better, and like then this enters into the question of the Earth was technically here before us, so like why are we entitled this right to then like destroy it? And like you're asking, like, don't we rather live in a world with 8 billion people? What if the world, like what if the Earth of itself is saying to us, like maybe we actually should have never become like 8 billion people? Like this is a whole other sort of tangent conversation.
It's a big one, and actually it's an aspect of your first question I didn't answer, so I'm glad you brought it up. But let me just ask you, like, what do you take it as the Earth? What does it mean to say the Earth is telling us we shouldn't have 8 billion people, and what would you prescribe if the Earth told you that? What would you do about it?
See, I don't necessarily have an answer, but then I'm just thinking to like the Incas, the Mayans, who were the Incans and the Mayans. Like these were thriving civilizations with their own sorts of like technological advances and stuff. And I'm wondering, like, I don't know, but did we make a mistake in becoming this industrialized and in becoming this developed? Like that's why I'm asking. I don't know, but I think it's a valuable claim, because like we just assume that like this constant growth and stuff is good, but I don't know that it is, and I don't know, maybe it's not the case.
Well, yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, is part of what you're suggesting that a lot of people in the modern world, especially given just the degree of abundance and comforts and distractions, waste their time in kind of superficial ways? Maybe
I'm saying that's an accusation. I wouldn't put that as a blanket thing myself.
Okay. Well, so just to finish, because I think maybe part of what you're getting at is that there is this view that a lot hold. I'm somewhat sympathetic to some version of this view that before there were all of these distractions and comforts, there were actually positive spiritual effects on human beings.
Like the mom and stuff like that. These are beliefs that people have.
When there's more deprivation, when life is harder, but there's also less possibility for just cheap, easy distraction, like the effects on human beings might be positive or something like. I mean, I think it's part of what you're getting at. So I'm curious, just if you could like maybe factor that into your response.
There are two questions. One is it morally right to value human flourishing? And then there's a question of call it industrial civilization or machine labor civilization, like, is that actually human flourishing? Is there some way in which it's not, which relates to what you're saying? Right, but but these are two issues, right? Because one is this a value? And then the second is an interpretation of the value. And so is it a value? I think yes, but it is important that it is, and I think there is an argument for this, but there is, in a sense, it's a plausible objection to what I'm saying. Sort of although I don't think it could really be defended, to say, I do not value human life. Like, I value unimpacted nature above human life, and therefore I think the planet should be dehumanized. That is, human beings should be reduced in numbers and impact to the point where they have virtually no impact on the rest of nature. Like, that is a coherent view. But then it is the reason I ask you what would you do about it is like that is a view that necessarily means like genocide of the entire world.
Or colonizing other planets.
Well, but then you would have the same, because that's clever, but you would have this same morality that said it's wrong to do it to the other planets.
Correct, but like because there's a reason people are looking at other planets, it's almost, I agree the same thing will happen, but it's almost implying then like, oh, we definitely messed up here in a way.
But the messing up, see, the issue is the messing up is our very existence to any level of success. Like, the only existence that's acceptable if unimpacted nature is the standard is human beings living as like a poorly functioning version of other animals, where we're just sort of scrounging for things. Like, you look at other animals, there's no such thing with other animals as most members of the species survive and live to a long age. Like infant mortality we think of as a tragedy because we're on a human flourishing standard. But you just look at other species, like individual members get wiped out all the time. That's just the normal thing. So human flourishing means something that, it means having a massive impact on the rest of nature. And so there is this question of, do you value that? And if you value that, you have to value impact. Now, it should be intelligent impact. It shouldn't be impact that's self-destructive. But I think one way to think of it is being on a human flourishing standard means you have the most pro-human relationship possible with the rest of nature. So it's not that you hate the rest of nature, that you want to turn it into a parking lot, because that wouldn't actually be good for you for all a parking lot. You need some of it to be a parking lot, and certain species are going to be in opposition to you, so you need to get rid of them, at least in certain places. Like you don't want a bear in your backyard, you don't want malarial mosquitoes flying around, but it's all based on a human flourishing standard. And what I find is when I talk to people about this issue, like when it comes down to it, almost everyone is, when I really lay the choices out, almost everyone is ultimately on a human flourishing standard. Usually what happens is because they believe the delicate nurturer premise to some degree, they think that our impact has to be self-destructive. But the more I explain, no, human beings are producers, we can produce more resources, we can make the earth cleaner, that doesn't have to stop, there's no limit to that. Once they get that human beings can impact the earth in a way that makes it better and better, including things like, life and other life and natural beauty, like we can have a better and better planet from every perspective, every related human perspective, then most people are pro-human flourishing. But it is possible for somebody to say and I think it's the only logical thing that any species who can think, and we're the only one who can, but any species who could identify their implicit moral code, like their goal would be they individually and their species does well. Like the lion's implicit moral code is lion flourishing. And it should be. But I'm a human and it should be human flourishing. And so I think that's the logic of it. And like philosophically, there are different views of this. But I'm a big fan of objectivist philosophy, which is Ayn Rand. And so she has an argument in her work about like why morality, there's no, without the need to benefit human life and human flourishing, there is no such thing as morality. Like morality comes from the need. Morality is like the instruction manual for human life, so it's incoherent to talk about morality in a way that is anti-human life, just like it would be, irrational to talk about like public speaking principles if you didn't want to be good at public speaking.
But so I think you were saying that when you press people and lay out the choices, they tend to actually come over to your side.
Yeah.
But you also think, I think, that deep down what's driving a lot of environmentalists is a kind of anti-human life premise, correct?
Yes.
Like you think that's actually what's going on deep down.
Yeah, that's a really good...
Well, so if that's true, I just wanted to note, like Hank and Jay, I don't know if you guys are thinking of Oswald Spengler right now. Yeah, but like one of our most recent speakers, John David Ebert, he gave a talk about Oswald Spengler. Have you heard of Oswald? It doesn't matter. He's like a German historian, but he argues that civilization moves in cycles, and he says, like every civilization has its springtime period when like religious, spiritual, artistic life is very vibrant, and then it kind of ossifies and just becomes political, economic, rationalistic, military, and kind of declines. So all civilizations rise and decline. He says one symptom of a declining civilization is when people start to question the value of human life, manifested by, or as illustrated by things like abortion, antinatalism, and I just think like your critique of the environmentalist movement very much fits within the Spenglerian view. Like Western civilization is in decline. People are beginning to doubt the value of human life. They're having fewer children. They're saying things like we don't want to bring children into the world. They're saying like humans maybe shouldn't even exist at all.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't. This is a big topic. I don't put those positions together. So like I think at least most abortion should be legal, and so that's a whole, that's not what I'm here to talk about, but like I believe that that's actually the pro-human position, which obviously people will disagree with, but we can talk about that sometime. But a lot of times with these, like, they're just, with different thinkers, like their frameworks for thinking can be so divergent in different ways. So I think this guy's conception of human life is different. So I think of it as, let me talk about the environmental movement. So what's going on there? Because it seems almost like a contradiction, because I'm saying that, well, but I said most people, when pressed, actually value human flourishing. Like they'll actually choose that, in part just because they're a human, they want to flourish. If there's a way, another way to put it is, if there's a way for human beings to flourish in harmony with one another and with the values that we think of the planet as having, including like, beautiful places and clean air and clean water and all kinds of cool species, like if that's possible and that's all, we can have it all, which I'm arguing, then people want that. But there are some people, I think, who do not actually want that. And there's a question of why is that the case? And I think, but I mentioned the animal rights thing. Like there are people who know very clearly that not doing animal testing will be bad for humans, but they're still against it. And so there's a question of, well, why would you be against your own species? There's a kind of logic there. And the answer, one big answer can be, if you feel like being against your own species will place you above members of your species that you envy. So this is and I'm a big Ayn Rand fan, this is, if you read Atlas Shrugged, this is a big theme in that. But like, if you just think of the hatred of like this idea of we hate the 1% in our society, like that as a popular thing to say, oh, I hate the 1%. Like, if you look at what the 1% do, at least a lot of them, it included people like Steve Jobs, like people who make our lives way better. So how could you say in blanket, I hate the 1%? You could say I hate the unearned 1%, but why do you say hate the 1%? Well, in that case, I think people who feel bad about themselves, who are not happy with what they're accomplishing in life, it's a very psychologically appealing view to say, hey, those people who are succeeding, they're actually bad, and you're actually good, because they're in the 1% and you're a part of the oppressed masses. And if you think of this with the anti-human impact thing, it's a similar thing. If you could say, like, I'm not very happy with my life, but all those people who are really successful and have money, can do all these kinds of things and get all these conventional rewards, they're actually the bad people. They're destroying the earth. They're having too big an impact. So I can look down on them and make myself feel good. So I think a lot of reasons why anti-human ideas, ideas that are anti-human in general, appeal to specific humans is because they elevate specific humans over the other humans that they envy or resent. So that, I think, is there's this connection between philosophy and psychology where often the people who come up with really bad ideas and the people who embrace them have an element of, I don't feel good about myself, this is going to elevate me above others. So in that sense, they're doing it, quote, selfishly, but it's not going to make them happy, and it's certainly going to make others miserable.
I'm sorry if this pisses people off, but it's kind of analogous to white progressives saying really bad things about white people. Like humans saying really bad things about humans.
Yeah.
Or humans taking a negative view of
right. So the idea,
in order to elevate themselves over
certain
humans.
I think there's but sort of like the idea that, this is, I want to take this more with a grain of salt because I want to focus on energy stuff just because that's where I have expertise. But I think I have expertise about this other thing, but you have no reason to think I have expertise about this other thing. Like, if somebody particularly is holding the view that, like, every person of a certain race, so in this case, like Caucasian descent, like, you are racist, not in the sense of like, oh, you're aware of race in a way we wish we weren't given, like, but no, like, you're racist in a really bad way. That can, people who say that, like, I forget her name, but the author of Robin, whatever, D'Angelo, like that, I've only seen her talk a little bit, so I haven't read her book, but I've studied this stuff quite a bit in general. Like, that's a position where, yeah, she's saying, yeah, I'm a racist, but like, I am the most woke racist in the world, right? Because I know that I'm a racist and you don't, and so I'm superior to you. And so that is a kind of superior. By the way, I don't like the appropriation of the word progressive for anti-individualist or anti-freedom causes. So I consider myself a genuine progressive, and that I want human progress, which I think is a pro-freedom position. There's this idea of conservative versus progressive, which I think both are bad terms. Like conservative means it's, progressive is, if you take liberal or progressive to mean it's good because it's new, that doesn't make any sense because new things could be good or they could be bad. But it's a hell of a lot better than things are good because they're old. Like things are good because they're true. And in America, conservative has a lot of good things to it because America has so much that's uniquely good to it. So in a sense, you want to conserve America, but the American founders were the ultimate progressives. They were radicals. So I think of it as like, so if I had to choose, I would be a progressive, but in the sense of I want to take the best ideas and move forward, not I just want to conserve whatever happens to exist.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on companies like Tesla who are trying to make electric energy, but electric cars more readily available to people.
So electric cars, you call them battery cars because you can do electricity with fossil fuels and you can do electricity with hydrogen, but these battery cars are battery electric cars. So it's all about what's, I mentioned this a long time earlier, but like it's all about cost effectiveness. So like what's the value it provides at what cost? What's particularly exciting about battery cars that have they have emissions in the process, but they don't have emissions when they're driving. I mean, it's a little heat, but but the emissions come from the power plants that are powering them. But one thing that's exciting about that is, the most exciting application of that, I think, is the tunnels, which Elon Musk is interested in, which is, to me, my favorite idea. Like, he has this boring company. Like, if you could do this cost effectively, which is questionable, but I hope you can, like if you could bore these tunnels underground, then you could have really rapid car transport, but those tunnels are much more conducive to something that doesn't have tailpipe emissions than something that does, because you don't have to have the same ventilation issues. So that would be an example. So there's certain contexts in which battery vehicles, oh, you mean already, there are certain contexts in which they are better and certain contexts in which they are worse, in terms of most of them don't have that much range. But the main thing is just the cost benefit of it. So right now, for most people, a battery vehicle is not cost effective, but if they become more cost effective, that's great. And what you see is it has to do with this issue of the concentration of the energy. So the batteries are becoming more concentrated, but they're nothing near oil. So that matters most the larger thing you're trying to move. So for like a cargo ship, you're not going to run that on a bunch of Tesla batteries, but a small vehicle or even a mid-sized vehicle, you might. And that might improve over time. Like a plane, you're not going to run on Tesla batteries. So I think the key is that it's not that we should be intrinsically in favor of oil-powered vehicles, but we should be in favor of the most cost-effective. We should be very wary of efforts to mandate these things when they're not cost-effective, and in particular, to mandate a scale that they've never existed on. Because these battery vehicles, like they're still very small percentage of the car market. So you think about if you mandate, 100% of us has to use this in 15 years. Like Gavin Newsom in California just said, basically, we have to have zero emissions vehicles by 2035. Like, you don't know what it's going to be like to scale all that lithium production and cobalt production. That may make sense, it may not. And the most obvious example of this is, look at what's happening to the electricity grid in America. It's becoming less reliable, particularly in California. Like, we don't have reliable electricity, and Newsom is saying, let's add a huge amount of electricity usage, particularly often that's needed at night to charge things when there's no solar. Like, this is a prescription for disaster. So we want the most cost-effective things, but that should be determined by competition and choice, not by some dictator saying, I like the idea of everyone having an electric car. But it could be in 20 years, like electric cars are dominant, and if they are and they earn it, that would be great.
Do you have a preference for a certain type of fossil fuel? Because I believe some fossil fuels are more environmentally friendly than others. At least I'm under the impression that natural gas is better for the environment than, say, oil.
If I had a preference for anything, it'd be nuclear, because it's very elegant. It's kind of like the perfect form of energy. But it's really about what's cost effective, including when you fit in side effects. Because like what I could say, well, I prefer natural gas because if you have an unlimited accessible supply of natural gas, you can power a power plant cheaply, and it's cleaner. Like it's at least easier to make clean because the raw material is pretty clean to start with, whereas coal requires a lot more purification because the material is a lot more messy, has a lot more impurities to start with. But do I like it more? Well, coal is much more significant right now in terms of alleviating the poverty of the poorest people in the world, because gas is a gas, so it's harder to transport. You can compress it or even liquefy it, but that takes a bunch of resources. So it's almost always cheaper in places that don't have a lot of gas there. It's, at least right now, maybe you could build pipelines and change that. I'm all for pipelines, but coal is pretty compact. It's super easy to move, and it's cheap. So that may be the key thing for the poorest people in the world. So I like it in that respect. And so the reason each of these is used in a very large quantity is because it has unique benefits to it for the people who are choosing to use it. Oil, I mean, oil, if I had to choose, it would be oil, because oil is so, there are unique things in the world that exist that nothing but oil can do. And that's not true of anything else. If you had enough oil, you could run every single thing in the world on oil. That's why it's the most, that's why of the fossil fuels it's the most expensive, and it's why we use it mostly for transportation, because it's uniquely valuable there. Because if you need a fixed source of energy, it doesn't matter that it's be super concentrated. You could just burn coal or gas. It doesn't have that big an advantage over oil. All right, well, I think we set a record for low number of people and high number of questions. So that's a credit. They're all great. And so yeah, thanks to you for putting this on and for having such a thoughtful, inquisitive group of students. And yeah, thanks everyone for asking questions and for challenging me, and for the 6, 7, 8 of you who have stayed along, 9.
And Stella. Let's thank Alex.
All right, thank you very much.